The two loves paradox is what happens when your heart is full, but the world sees it as divided. You love two people honestly, deeply, differently, and you say it out loud, hoping that truth will make it pure. But it doesn't. Instead, it makes you look like a liar, like someone cheating with honesty as your excuse. Even when you hide nothing, you're treated as if you're hiding everything. That's the paradox. Love, the thing we're told to give freely, becomes evidence against you the moment it exceeds one recipient. Imagine this: you're sitting across from someone you love and you tell them the truth. You tell them they're not the only one. You explain it's not about betrayal, not about replacement, not about deficiency. It's just that both people matter, each in their own way. And while you say it gently, clearly, with care, you can see their face change. The disappointment, the fear, the flicker of pain. You didn't lie, you didn't sneak around, but you still look like someone who did. Because the world is built on the assumption that love must be exclusive, that choosing one is proof that it's real, that dividing it means it's weaker. But you know how you feel. You know it's not divided, it's multiplied. Still, logic doesn't win this one. Emotion writes its own rules. And in the eyes of the one who hears you say it, your honesty becomes the wound. This isn't about infidelity. It's about the impossibility of sharing truth when that truth threatens someone's emotional stability. You're not trying to manipulate or deceive or keep both out of convenience. You're trying to be seen as whole, even if that whole includes more than one connection. But love isn't judged by depth, it's judged by direction. And if it points two ways, people assume one of them must be fake. You begin to question yourself. Maybe you should have stayed silent, maybe clarity wasn't kindness, maybe love in its truest form must be hidden unless it fits the script. But that script was never yours. You don't want to choose because there's nothing to choose against. You're not comparing, you're not weighing, you're not looking for more. You simply feel. Two lives, two lights, both real. And somehow that reality feels like betrayal. It plays out in the quiet, in how you edit your words, in how you shrink your feelings, in how you become careful instead of open. Because the moment you share too much, you're seen as someone who gives too little. And the strangest thing is, if you had lied, if you had hidden it, if you had played the game like others do, maybe no one would have called you disloyal. It's not the love that makes them leave, it's the confession. People think of love like territory. If someone else is there, they feel pushed out. But it's not always like that. Sometimes love is a mosaic, not a spotlight. Not everyone understands that, and maybe they don't have to. But the price of honesty is isolation, not because you're wrong, but because you're misread. You begin to carry guilt that doesn't belong to you. You apologize for feelings that were never meant to hurt anyone. You start questioning the very thing that gave your heart its expansion. You wonder if it's possible to be good when your truth hurts others. And you wonder why love, the most sacred emotion, becomes so quickly twisted into proof of failure. There's a deeper cruelty in this paradox. Not just that you're misunderstood, but that your very effort to be understood becomes the weapon used against you. You didn't cheat, you didn't lie, you didn't break anything, but you still feel like a criminal. Like someone standing trial for being honest about something they didn't ask for, didn't plan, didn't control. And yet you still love them, both, even after the accusations, even after the loss, even after the silence, because the love was never about approval. It was never conditional on being accepted. It simply was, and that's what makes the paradox so painful. That something so sincere can still look like betrayal. That truth can hurt more than deceit. That your heart can be full and you still walk alone. You begin to ask yourself, is love only valid when it's simple? Is it only trustworthy when it's singular? Can two truths exist at once, two affections, two bonds, two meanings, without collapsing into contradiction? Can love still be real if the world sees it as betrayal? The escape loop begins the moment you tell your mind not to think about something. It's such a simple command, so reasonable. You have a thought you don't like, it feels wrong, irrational, uncomfortable, and you just want it gone, that's all. You're not trying to deny reality, you're not being dramatic, you're just trying to move on. But the moment you resist the thought, it grows teeth, it tightens. It coils in place like something waiting to strike, and what once was a passing flicker now becomes a full loop, playing on repeat every time you beg it to stop. Imagine this: you're standing on a balcony, you're not sad, you're not suicidal, you're just looking at the view. And suddenly your mind whispers, what if you jumped? It's not a desire, it's not a plan, it's not even a fear at first, it's just a question, a flicker, but it hits you the wrong way, you back up, your chest tightens, you feel ashamed, you tell yourself that you shouldn't think that normal people don't think that, and then the loop begins. The next time you see a ledge, it's there. The whisper, the panic, the shame, the more you try to block it, the louder it becomes. Not because the thought matters, but because you gave it meaning. That's the escape loop, a mental paradox where the more you try to avoid a thought, the more you rehearse it. The more you push it away, the closer it comes. You want silence, but you create noise. You want peace, but your defense becomes the war. This happens because the brain doesn't respond to logic, it responds to attention. And attention, even negative attention, feeds a thought. You're not entertaining the idea, but your fear tells your nervous system that it's real. So your body responds, tension, racing heart, sleepless nights. And soon the thought becomes a threat, not because it's true, but because it won't leave. Not because it reflects who you are, but because you can't unthink it. The thought becomes terrifying not in its content, but in its persistence. And the worst part is you don't want to talk about it. You're scared someone will think you're broken, that you're dangerous, that you've lost control, so you keep it secret. You hide the storm. You pretend everything's fine while internally policing your own mind like it's a crime scene. You feel guilty for even having the thought, but guilt doesn't erase thoughts, it reinforces them. People misunderstand this loop. They think obsessive thoughts are about desire, that if you think it, you must want it. But the loop isn't about desire, it's about resistance. It's not what you want to happen, it's what you're terrified might happen, and that fear feeds the cycle. It shows up everywhere. You're about to give a speech and your brain says, "What if I forget every word?" You're holding a knife in the kitchen and your brain says, "What if I lose control?" You're driving and your brain says, "What if I crash on purpose?" You know you won't, but the thought appears. And the more you hate it, the more it haunts you. It's not mental illness, it's not weakness. It's the machinery of attention turning on itself, a loop made of your own awareness. The mind is like a mirror when it reflects something unwanted. Smashing the mirror doesn't help, but that's what we try to do. We fight the reflection instead of letting it pass. And so you build rituals. You try to distract yourself with noise, movement, perfectionism. You seek control, cleanliness, order, anything to prove to yourself that you're okay. But the rituals don't bring peace, they bring dependency. And when they fail, the panic grows, because now the thought is back and your defense didn't work. Now you're trapped with no shield. That's when people start avoiding life, avoiding silence, avoiding stillness. Because in the stillness, the loop plays loudest. But here's the truth you eventually learn, slowly, painfully, sometimes through therapy, sometimes alone on the floor at 3 a.m. You can't win a war against your own mind. You can't logic your way out of a loop that was never built from logic. And you can't escape something that only exists because you're trying to escape it. Freedom begins when you stop fighting. Not by giving in to the thought, but by letting it pass through you without reaction. You stop labeling it as important. You stop analyzing what it means. You stop trying to cleanse your mind like it's dirty. You treat the thought like a cloud in the sky, there then gone. You stop making meaning out of what was never meant to mean anything. And slowly the loop loosens, not because you forced it, but because you stopped feeding it. The irony is cruel. The harder you try to make the thought disappear, the more permanent it becomes. But the moment you say, "Fine, be here, I'm not scared of you," it fades, not instantly, not cleanly, but eventually, like a bruise that stops hurting once you stop pressing on it. This paradox isn't just about psychology, it's about the human need for control. We want to master our thoughts, to decide what stays in our minds, but the mind isn't a machine, it's a storm, a dream, a mess of symbols and signals and memories. You don't get to decide every image that flickers across your consciousness, but you do get to decide what you do with it, and most of the time the answer is nothing. The escape loop teaches you something you never wanted to learn, that peace isn't the absence of unwanted thoughts, but the absence of fear around them. That you can have the thought and still be okay, that the storm can rage and you can stay still, that you don't have to fix everything your mind imagines. Some people live their whole lives in the loop, not because they're weak, but because no one ever told them the truth, that it's okay to have a weird thought, that you're not defined by the voice in your head, that every human mind generates nonsense, darkness, absurdity, and that none of it makes you broken. You're only stuck because you believed you shouldn't be. There's something beautiful in that realization, terrifying but freeing, that your mind will never be perfect, that the thoughts will never be under total control, but that you can still live, still love, still sleep at night, even with the loop running in the background, because once it no longer scares you, it loses its power. You stop avoiding balconies, you stop fearing silence, you stop censoring your own awareness, and when the thought comes again, you nod and say, "There you are," and you let it pass, and it does. Because you're not the thought, you're the one watching it, and maybe that's all you ever needed to remember. Can something really trap you if you stop trying to escape? The want-fear conflict is what happens when you crave intimacy more than anything, but the moment someone gets too close, you pull away. You wait for connection, you long for warmth, you dream of being truly seen, and then when it arrives, you flinch. Not because it's wrong, not because it hurts, but because it touches something too deep, too dangerous, too close to the parts of you that are still unhealed. And so, even though you want it, you back away. Even though you reach for it, you sabotage it. Even though you need it, you hide. It starts quietly. You meet someone and something in you lights up. It's not even romantic at first. It's emotional, a look, a tone, a shared silence that feels safe. You feel recognized, not just liked, but understood. And it terrifies you, because that understanding could lead somewhere real. And real things break, real things demand, real things uncover what you've spent years trying to protect. So instead of opening up, you retreat, you joke, you deflect, you pretend you don't care as much as you do. You create distance, little by little, texts unanswered, calls delayed, eye contact avoided. You don't mean to hurt them. You're just trying to protect yourself from what might come if they see too much. Because what if they don't stay? Or worse, what if they do? This is the paradox, that the thing you want most feels like danger. That love, the thing that should heal, feels like exposure. And that even when someone means no harm, you can't help but prepare for it. Because deep down, you believe closeness is conditional, that it will disappear when you're not perfect, that if they knew the real you, they'd leave. So you give them the version they can admire, the version you can control. You stay likable but unreachable, present but guarded. And when they ask what's wrong, you smile and say, nothing, and part of you means it. Because the pain isn't from what's happening, it's from what you're remembering, from old wounds that taught you to keep your distance if you want to survive. This is where people misunderstand avoidance. They think you're cold, selfish, detached, but you're not. You feel too much. That's the problem. You're flooded with emotion the moment something becomes real, and your nervous system interprets that flood as a threat, so it does what it always does, pulls you away. It doesn't matter how kind they are, how patient, how safe, because safety isn't external, it's internal. And if you don't feel safe in yourself, no one else can convince you. You'll scan for danger in their tone, their pauses, their silences. You'll assume rejection before it happens and then behave in ways that make it inevitable, not because you want to be alone, but because you've learned that distance is easier than disappointment. And still, the longing remains. You go home and miss them. You replay their messages. You wonder if you made a mistake, but when they come close again, the pattern repeats. It's not that you don't want love, you just don't want what it demands: vulnerability, exposure, surrender. You want to be held but not seen, wanted but not known, and that contradiction is exhausting. You might even find yourself drawn to people who are unavailable, not because you enjoy the chase, but because it's safe. Their distance allows you to feel without risking intimacy. You can fantasize without confronting your fear. You can hurt without opening. You can love without being loved back. Because being loved back would mean facing the one thing you're not sure you can handle, being known fully and staying anyway. This paradox follows you through friendships, relationships, even therapy. You speak half-truths. You intellectualize feelings instead of feeling them. You turn confession into performance. Because if you control the story, maybe it won't hurt as much. But control is the opposite of connection. You can't be held by someone if you're always holding yourself together. The cruel part is, most people don't even realize you're struggling. They just think you're distant, detached, not serious. They don't see the war between your ribs, the screaming part that wants closeness and the shaking part that doesn't trust it. And when they walk away, they don't see it as proof of your fear. They see it as proof of your disinterest, which only confirms your belief that no one really wants you once they see your chaos. So you build a life that looks stable. You succeed, you socialize, you function. But inside, every connection feels temporary, conditional, fragile. And every time someone gets too close, you feel the edge of something sharp, like a memory of abandonment, even if it hasn't happened yet. This isn't weakness, it's survival. It's what happens when your history taught you that love costs too much. That vulnerability invites pain. That letting someone in means giving them the power to hurt you in ways you may not recover from. And so you love from a distance, close in. Ought to feel it, far enough to survive it. But the loop doesn't end until you recognize it. Until you stop blaming yourself for not being ready, until you stop trying to force closeness before trust is real. Healing isn't about jumping in, it's about understanding why you flinch, why you freeze, why you run. And slowly you start to practice staying, not with everyone, but with someone. You let them see a little more. You tell the truth when it's easier to lie. You stay in the discomfort long enough to learn that it won't kill you. And each time you do, the fear loses a little power. You realize that the fear doesn't go away, but you get better at not letting it drive. You get better at holding space for both parts of you, the one that wants to be held and the one that wants to run. And over time, they learn to coexist. Because love is never clean, it's never without risk. But sometimes, the scariest thing you can do is exactly what you need. Can you let someone in, even if part of you wants to run? Meaning exhaustion is what happens when your search for purpose becomes the very thing that drains your life of meaning. You wake up each day with a quiet urgency, a sense that you must do something important, something bigger, something that justifies your existence. At first, it feels noble, motivating. You read the books, chase the goals, listen to the voices that promise clarity, enlightenment, fulfillment. You tell yourself that once you find your purpose, everything will click into place. The chaos will stop. The anxiety will dissolve, you'll be whole, but instead the opposite begins to happen. The more you chase meaning, the less meaning you find, and eventually your life starts to feel like a task without a center, a constant reaching, a constant failing, a constant loop. At first, it doesn't feel like a problem. You just feel driven, focused. You don't notice how tired you are because the pursuit feels sacred. You romanticize the hunger. You believe that discomfort means you're growing, that emptiness means you're close. You follow the advice to find your why, and when you can't, you blame yourself. You think you're not trying hard enough, not listening deep enough, not meditating long enough. So you double down, you cut out distractions, you build a routine. You commit to improvement, you become obsessed with becoming. But becoming never ends. There's always a new level, a new idea, a new transformation to undergo. And as you keep ascending, you lose something essential, the ability to enjoy the ordinary, the ability to sit in a moment without asking what it means. You stop laughing freely. You stop sleeping deeply. You stop loving without evaluation because everything has to matter. Everything has to be part of the mission. Everything has to be proof that you're on the right track. This is when meaning becomes a trap. You begin to feel guilty for rest, guilty for joy that isn't productive, guilty for relationships that do elevate you. You chase a future version of yourself that always seems one step ahead, and even when good things happen, you can't feel them because they don't match the story of purpose you've built in your head. You start to look around and wonder why others seem content, why they can laugh without analyzing it, why they can love without a spiritual breakthrough, why they can watch a movie without turning it into a metaphor. You envy their lightness, not because you want to be like them, but because you're so heavy, so tired, so lost in the very thing that was supposed to save you. This paradox is subtle, no one warns you about it, because on the surface you look inspired, disciplined, awake. People admire your intensity. They don't see that it's eating you alive, that you can't stop, that every failure to find the answer feels like a moral failure, a spiritual collapse, a sign that you're wasting your life. And so you try harder, you switch paths. You try minimalism, maximalism, mysticism, entrepreneurship. You fast, you journal, you build frameworks, you break them. You search for teachers, only to discard them when they fall short. You measure yourself by how close you are to feeling something that can't be measured, and with every step, the goalpost moves. Because meaning is not a destination, it's a lens. And once that lens becomes a microscope, you stop seeing the world, you only see your lack, your failure to be aligned, your inability to feel peace. You become the center of a story that was never meant to be about you, and even your suffering becomes performative, something to transcend, something to extract lessons from. You forget how to just suffer, how to just feel, how to just be. You talk to others, but not really. You listen, but you're listening for patterns, for symbols, for signs. Even your friendships become mirrors for your search. You stop being a person and start being a project. And every day you don't figure it out, you feel further from yourself, the self you haven't actually met because you've only been chasing an ideal. This is what burnout of the soul looks like, not just fatigue, but disorientation. You lie awake at night, not from stress, but from the quiet dread that maybe there is no big answer, that maybe your life isn't meant to be some cinematic arc, that maybe the point isn't to find a point, but to live honestly in the absence of one. And that thought terrifies you, because if there's no deeper reason than what justifies the pain, what explains the loneliness, what redeems the suffering, if there's no higher purpose, then maybe you just exist, and that feels like failure, like nihilism, like giving up, but maybe it isn't, maybe it's freedom. Because meaning isn't something you find, it's something you give. And once you stop hunting it like prey, it begins to appear in places you never looked, in making tea, in walking your dog, in doing the laundry, in laughing at a dumb joke, in missing someone, in being in not knowing what you're doing, and being okay anyway. The meaning exhaustion doesn't go away by reading the right book or hearing the right podcast. It goes away when you stop turning your life into a performance, when you stop using purpose as a way to earn existence, when you realize that the weight you carry isn't from not having meaning, it's from believing that you're not allowed to exist without one. Because you are not here to earn your breath, you are not a test. Can life still be meaningful if you stop trying to prove that it is? The knowing not doing paradox is what happens when you're fully aware of what needs to be done, but you don't do it. You wake up knowing exactly what would make your life better. You know which call to make, which habit to break, which words to say, which action to take. The logic is clear, the steps are simple, the consequences of delay are obvious. And yet you stall, you scroll, you pace, you distract, you delay. You watch yourself not doing the very thing you promised yourself you would, again. It's not about laziness, it never was. Laziness implies a lack of desire, but you want to change desperately. You fantasize about how different life could be. You picture yourself stronger, healthier, freer ahead. You imagine how proud you'd feel if you just did the thing, and still you sit, aware, frustrated, frozen. You start negotiating with yourself. Just 5 more minutes, just one more video. I'll start tomorrow. I'll start when I'm rested, when I'm ready, but readiness never comes, because this isn't a time problem, it's a friction problem. There's a hidden resistance beneath the surface, something deeper than intention, something emotional, something ancient, something that logic can't touch. So you try to outsmart it. You set timers, build schedules, make lists. You read productivity books, watch motivational videos, set alarms labeled no excuses. And for a while it works. You feel like you've cracked the code, until one day you fall off again and the spiral begins. You go from progress to paralysis, momentum to meltdown, clarity to chaos, all without knowing why. This is the paradox. You're not confused, and yet you're stuck. You don't need more information, and yet you feel unprepared. You know what's right, and yet you choose what's easy. And that contradiction eats at you not just because it slows you down, but because it makes you doubt yourself. You start to wonder if something is broken in you, if you'll always be this person, aware but inactive, capable but unmoving, brilliant in theory but absent in practice. And the worst part, no one sees it. From the outside you look fine, functional, maybe even successful. People compliment your insight, your clarity, your potential. They say you're smart and deep and thoughtful. And you smile knowing that inside, none of those qualities are translating into action. You feel like a fraud, not because you're lying, but because your reality never matches your vision. You begin to resent yourself, to punish yourself silently. You feel guilty when you rest, you overthink when you act, you shrink from your own expectations, and you start to identify with the gap, not as someone who's stuck right now, but as someone who is forever stuck. You start to believe the delay defines you, that your hesitation is your personality, that your inaction is proof that something in you just doesn't work the way it should, but it's not that simple. Because when you look closer, you realize you're not avoiding the task. You're avoiding the feeling that comes with the task. You're not afraid of doing the work. You're afraid of what it will confront in you. The fear of failure, the fear of not being good enough, the fear of succeeding and not knowing what comes next, the fear that even your best effort might not be enough to change anything at all. And so you stay in the safe zone, where you can dream without risk, where you can imagine progress without testing yourself, where you can plan endlessly without facing the possibility of falling short. You turn awareness into a shield, reflection into a delay tactic, preparation into protection, because as long as you haven't tried, you haven't failed. As long as you're thinking, you're safe. But that safety is an illusion, because the longer you wait, the heavier it gets. The guilt builds, the shame deepens, and the thing you avoided becomes larger than life, not because it grew, but because you gave it time to expand, time to mutate, time to scare you into believing it's now too late. And still the knowing remains, that never leaves. No matter how long you wait, the voice stays, gentle, unimpressed, patient. It reminds you quietly that you already know what to do, that you always have. The paradox isn't that you're weak, it's that you think you need to feel different before you can act. That motivation must precede motion. But what if it's the other way around? What if movement creates meaning? What if action is what wakes up the part of you that's been sleeping? You won't always feel ready, you won't always feel brave, you won't always be inspired, but the moment you take even one step, something shifts. Not everything, not all at once, but enough to break the loop, enough to prove to yourself that knowing isn't wasted if it's followed, even imperfectly, by doing, because you already know you've always known. So what happens now when you run out of excuses but not out of time? The emotional mirror is what happens when the people you love the most reflect back the parts of you you wish you didn't see. You think love will soften you, complete you, validate you, but instead it reveals you. It holds up a mirror so honest, so sharp that you can't look away from what's in it. And sometimes that mirror doesn't show beauty. It shows your defensiveness, your impatience, your control, your fear. The parts of you that were easy to ignore when you were alone, but now someone else sees them too. At first, love feels warm, familiar, safe. You feel seen, but only the good parts. The charming ones, the generous ones, the ones you've practiced showing. You're kind, you listen, you give, you smile when they smile, and something in you hopes that this time maybe this connection will heal you, will complete the story, will fix what silence and solitude couldn't. but then the closeness deepens, and with that closeness comes reflection. Not the polished kind, but the kind that shows your face when you're tired, angry, scared. You hear your own voice in arguments and wonder who you're becoming. You see the look on their face when you pull away. You notice how much it hurts to disappoint them. And you begin to realize love isn't hiding you, it's revealing you. This is the paradox, that love brings you closer not just to another person, but to the parts of yourself you've been avoiding. You think you're learning them, but you're actually meeting the real you, the one who needs control because they fear abandonment, the one who shuts down because vulnerability feels like exposure, the one who apologizes too fast to avoid tension, the one who stays silent not out of peace, but fear of being misunderstood. You see it all reflected in how they react, how they respond, how they feel around you, and it's not always comfortable. It's not always flattering. You start to notice your patterns, how quickly you go from closeness to withdrawal, how easily your tone shifts when you feel threatened, how much you expect from them without asking, how often you take their presence as proof of your worth. Love doesn't give you new flaws, it just makes the old ones visible, not because love is cruel, but because it's clear. And clarity can feel brutal when you've spent your life trying not to see yourself fully. It's even harder because they mirror back not only what you are, but what you aren't yet. Their needs expose your limitations. Their wounds trigger your defenses, their pain highlights your distance, and sometimes they love you in ways you don't yet know how to accept, with patience you can't yet match, with openness that scares you, with honesty that feels too raw, and you push them away, not because you don't love them, but because their love unsettles the fragile balance you've built inside. This is what no one tells you about real connection, that it's not just about comfort, it's about confrontation. You will see your emotional immaturity, your selfishness, your neediness, your fear, and if you're not ready, you'll blame them for making you feel it. You'll call them too sensitive, too demanding, too much. But deep down, you know they're not too much. They're just touching a part of you that isn't ready to be seen. You might even leave or make them leave, not because the relationship was wrong, but because the mirror was too clear. Because loving them required you to outgrow the version of yourself you were comfortable with, and growth, when uninvited, feels like loss, like identity melting, like ego dissolving, like death. But if you stay, if you look, something else happens. You begin to soften, not perfectly, not overnight, but you start to recognize your emotional reactions as signals, not truths. You begin to ask, why did I pull away, instead of defending it? You start to own the pain you cause instead of explaining it away. You begin to see that the discomfort you feel isn't an attack, it's an invitation. Because the mirror doesn't lie, it doesn't flatter, but it can heal if you let it. If you let the reflection be not a verdict, but a starting point. You begin to thank them not for showing you your best self, but for showing you your real one. And in that space, something tender happens. You stop needing to be right. You stop needing to win. You stop needing to hide. You start needing to grow, and you let love help you do it. This doesn't mean staying in pain. It doesn't mean accepting mistreatment. Not all mirrors are healthy. But the right ones, the ones held by those who love you gently, honestly, can be the clearest path to becoming who you were always meant to be. Not someone flawless, but someone self-aware, someone capable of change, someone worthy of closeness because they no longer fear what it reveals. You may never fully like what the mirror shows. That's okay. Growth isn't about loving every part of yourself, it's about having the courage to look anyway, to stay, to see. To keep becoming. What if the version of you you're avoiding is the one they already love? The memory trap is what happens when the past becomes too vivid to ignore but too distant to reclaim, when the very things that once brought you joy return not as comfort, but as ache. Memory, which should be the gentle record of a life lived, instead becomes a mechanism of loss, a loop that replays what cannot be touched again. The people, the moments, the exact inflection of a laugh, the warmth of a summer night, the feeling of being entirely understood in a specific time and place, all of it remains intact inside your mind, unchanged, perfect. But the perfection is what wounds you, because life has moved on but the memory hasn't. It waits, frozen, and every time you visit it, you're reminded not just of what was, but of what can no longer be. Imagine walking into a place you haven't seen in years, a childhood home, an old cafe, a corner of a city that once meant everything. For a moment, time collapses. Everything looks smaller, quieter, slightly faded, but it's still there. You sit where you once sat, stand where you once laughed, and if you close your eyes, you can almost feel it. Not just see it, feel it, the version of you who used to be here. The conversations, the music, the light at a certain hour. But then the moment breaks and you realize you're alone now, that everyone who made that memory what it was is elsewhere, that some of them have changed and some of them are gone and most of them will never return in the form your memory preserved them. You're left suspended between two timelines, what is and what once was, and even though you're not trying to live in the past keeps living in you. This is the trap. That memory doesn't just recall, it recreates. It brings the emotional architecture of an earlier life into the present with a precision that current experience can rarely match. You compare new relationships to old ones, not because the old ones were perfect, but because their meaning is fixed. They've ended, and in ending, they've become symbols. The people in them don't grow or disappoint anymore, they only echo. And so the past feels deeper, more certain, more vivid than the chaotic present ever could. You begin to chase a standard built not on reality, but on remembrance. The paradox intensifies when you realize that some of your most painful memories are the ones you don't want to let go of. Because inside the pain there was love. Inside the goodbye there was once an arrival. You hold on not to the moment it broke, but to the moment right before. You revisit the night you laughed uncontrollably in the backseat of a car, the morning you woke up and everything made sense, the conversation that shifted how you saw yourself. These memories are not just nostalgic, they are sacred. And yet, every time you reach for them, they cut a little deeper, because they do not lead you back. They only remind you of the road that's closed. People will tell you to move on, to stop looking back, to focus on what's ahead. But they don't understand that remembering isn't always a choice. The mind is not linear. It doesn't care about closure. It stores joy and grief side by side and pulls them both into the present at random. A scent, a voice, a photo, even silence itself, any of these can become a portal. And when it opens, you don't just think, you relive. Not in full, not in detail, but in feeling. And no matter how much time has passed, the feeling still knows your name. You start to fear your own memories, not because they're bad, but because they're too good to be here now. They remind you that life once felt simple, full, awake, and in comparison, the present feels dim. It's not that your life is empty, it's that your reference point has been frozen at a peak, and everything that follows feels insufficient not by its own merit, but by contrast. This phenomenon doesn't only haunt those who have lost something dramatic. It happens slowly, even in normal lives. You get older, things change, people drift. What once was spontaneous becomes scheduled. What once was new becomes routine. And memory in its precision begins to act like a filter that makes the past feel golden and the present feel grayscale. Not because the present lacks color, but because your memory has edited the past into highlight reels. You begin to wonder if you're living at all anymore, or just collecting new material for future nostalgia. You take photos of moments you're not truly in. You anticipate missing them before they're even over. And in doing so, you never quite inhabit the now. You become a curator of your own emotional museum, walking through it daily, unable to leave. But here's the deeper question. Why do we return to the past at all? Is it just habit, sentiment, or is there something unresolved that we're still trying to understand? Memory doesn't only replay, it reframes, it tries to find meaning. You go back not just to feel, but to make sense. To ask, what did that moment mean? Who was I then? What did I lose? And why does it still matter? There's no harm in remembering, but when memory becomes more alive than life itself, something shifts. You begin to live backward. You stop creating new experiences because they can't compete. You become cautious, controlled. You protect the memory by avoiding the mess of real life. You tell yourself that nothing will ever compare, and so nothing ever gets the chance. And yet memory is not the enemy. It's just a mirror. It shows you what you're capable of feeling, what mattered, what left a mark. If it hurts, it's only because it meant something. If it returns, it's only because something in you is still listening. The pain of memory isn't a flaw, it's evidence that you lived. But the trap remains when you ask memory to do what only presence can hold you. No matter how vivid, the past cannot warm your hands, it cannot reply to your messages. It cannot offer newness, change, or future, it can only echo. And echo is not the same as being, so you have a choice. You can visit the past and honor it, or you can ask yourself if you're ready to stop expecting it to save you, because what once held you might now be holding you back. Can you remember something beautiful without letting it replace what comes next? The guilt loop is what happens when the act of resting, which should replenish you, becomes a reason to punish yourself, when the very moments meant for healing are corrupted by the internal voice that tells you haven't earned them. You find yourself in a rare hour of silence, no deadlines looming, no one calling your name, no task urgently demanding completion, and instead of relief, you feel a rising unease. You sit on the couch, your body finally still, and yet your mind accelerates. You think of the emails you haven't answered, the texts you should have replied to, the projects that are waiting, the version of yourself you promised you'd become by now. You are still, but you are not at peace. You are paused, but not present, because in your mind, stillness equals failure, and this is where the loop begins. The guilt doesn't arrive all at once, it creeps in. You tell yourself you'll rest for a few minutes. You open a video, a book, a window. But behind that screen sits another voice, the one that whispers, "Is this really what you should be doing right now?" it doesn't scream, it doesn't shame, it just plants doubt, the kind that lingers, the kind that doesn't let you enjoy the very thing you longed for when you were exhausted. And now that you have it rest, quiet space, you don't feel restored. You feel undeserving. It's not about time management, it's not about ambition, it's about identity. Somewhere along the way, you learned that your worth is tied to your output. That value comes from what you do, not who you are. So when you're not doing, you begin to feel invisible, irrelevant, replaceable. You equate movement with progress and progress with safety. And when there is no movement, your mind fills the space with accusation. You didn't rest too long, but you felt like you did. And feeling is enough to activate the loop. This guilt doesn't fade when you return to work. It lingers, it compounds, because now your rest has a price. You're behind, you have to catch up. You should have started earlier. You should have done more yesterday. And because you didn't, now you can't afford to pause again. You push harder, you stay up later, you say yes to more. You perform urgency, not because the world asked you to, but because guilt demanded it. And when your body inevitably pushes back, with fatigue, distraction, burnout, you don't slow down. You punish yourself further. You call it discipline, you call it high standards, you call it responsibility, but deep down you know it's something else. It's fear. Fear of being perceived as lazy, fear of not being enough, fear of losing your place. And so you wear guilt like a motor, not realizing it's burning through everything that once made your work meaningful. People around you might applaud your output. They call you productive, reliable, driven, but they don't see the cost. They don't see the nights you lie awake calculating wasted hours, the weekends you can't enjoy because Monday is already waiting, the conversations you miss because your mind is elsewhere, the vacations that feel more like assignments, documented, optimized, scheduled. They see the product, they don't feel the pressure. And when you try to explain it, you struggle to find words. How do you tell someone that rest makes you feel selfish, that leisure triggers your fight or flight response, that the sight of an unread message or an unchecked box floods you with dread? They tell you to relax, to enjoy life, to breathe, and you nod, you agree, but nothing changes, because the guilt is deeper than logic, it's in your wiring. You weren't born this way, you were shaped by systems, by families, by moments where achievement meant love, where perfection meant safety, where being good meant being quiet and doing what was expected. Over time, you learned that approval was earned, that ease was dangerous, that to be at peace was to risk being forgotten. So now, even when no one is watching, you perform, for a scoreboard that doesn't exist, for critics who live only in your mind. You reject comfort unless it's earned, you deny pleasure unless it's productive, and when you finally crash, you call it weakness. You promise to do better tomorrow, you build the same loop again, brick by brick. But what if the loop isn't helping you? What if it's eroding you? What if the voice that keeps you in motion is the same one that keeps you from living? You begin to ask deeper questions, not about your calendar, but your beliefs. Who taught you that guilt is the price of being alive? Who told you that stillness must be justified? Who convinced you that rest is something to recover from? And what would happen if you didn't believe them anymore? Not instantly, not completely, but a little at a time. You begin to practice rest not as indulgence, but as rebellion, as recovery, as reclamation of a self that exists outside performance. You remind yourself that you are not a machine, not a role, not a result. You are a person. And people need pause. The guilt doesn't vanish, it rises, but now you recognize it, you name it, you say, this is the loop, it's not the truth. And you let it pass, you don't obey it, you don't feed it. You let rest be what it always was supposed to be, a place to return to, not run from. Because the world will always give you more to do, but it will never give you permission to stop. That permission has to come from you. What if rest isn't a reward for finishing, but a right for existing? The self-sabotage paradox is what happens when you destroy what you love, not because you want to lose it, but because losing it on your own terms feels safer than being caught off guard. You care deeply, maybe even more than you're willing to admit. You found something rare, something that makes you feel alive, hopeful, real. But beneath that hope lives a fear that it won't last, that you don't deserve it, that sooner or later it will leave you or fall apart, and when it does, it will break you. And so you do something that defies logic. You break it first. You test it, starve it, hide from it, shrink it, sabotage it, not because it isn't good, but because it's too good to be safe. Imagine being in a relationship that finally feels like home. It's not perfect, but it's real. The person sees you, they stay, they choose you every day without condition. And yet after a while, that very closeness begins to activate something in you. You start noticing small things, things that weren't problems before. You create arguments where none are needed. You withdraw, pull away, flirt with someone else, or go cold for no reason. You don't understand it yourself. You tell yourself you're just tired, just anxious, just overwhelmed. but deep down, you know something else is happening. You're rehearsing the end, you're making sure it's on your terms. This is where the paradox lives, in the dissonance between love and fear, between wanting to be held and fearing what that holding demands. You crave connection, but the moment it feels solid, you imagine its collapse. And instead of waiting for the moment it breaks, you push it to break now while you still have control. That way, the pain comes with a sense of choice. You didn't lose it, you let it go. But the truth is, you never wanted to let it go. You just didn't know how to trust that it would stay. This isn't about recklessness, it's about protection. Somewhere in your story, you learned that stability can't be trusted. That joy is temporary, that love is a setup. You watch something precious vanish, maybe once, maybe over and over, and now every time something feels good, your body braces. Your mind scans for warning signs, and when none appear, it invents them, not to ruin things, but to survive them. Become hyperaware, hypervigilant. You analyze tone, timing, microexpressions. You look for coldness where there is none. You assign meaning to silences. You overthink kind words. You turn affection into expectation and kindness into pressure. You begin to resent the thing you love because its presence now feels like a countdown. And you'd rather leave while it's good than stay until it turns bad. You'd rather sabotage it than sit in the vulnerability of not knowing how or when it might slip away. And so you pull back, not dramatically, but just enough to weaken the bond. You stop answering texts as quickly. You start holding back excitement. You stop saying how much they mean to you. You keep secrets. You create distance. And when they notice, you act confused. You pretend you don't know what's wrong, but you do. You're waiting for them to say what's going on so you can finally say, I don't know if this is working. Because if you end it, it's not failure, it's agency. It's protection dressed as decision. But self-sabotage isn't limited to love. It shows up in work, in creativity, in opportunity. You get the job and suddenly you feel like an imposter. You stop trying, you miss deadlines, you tell yourself it's not right for you. You were never passionate about it anyway. Or you launch something, a business or a project, and the moment it gains traction, you retreat. You stop promoting, you stop believing, you call it boredom. But it's not, it's fear of success. Fear that once people see you clearly, they'll change their minds, and so you leave before they can. The pain of sabotage isn't immediate, it's slow. It comes later when the dust settles and you realize what you lost wasn't the thing itself. It was your chance to believe that you could hold something without destroying it, that you could stay, that you could be chosen and still choose back. And the worst part is no one sees this. From the outside, it looks like flakiness, disinterest, bad timing. They say you had something good, why'd you ruin it? But they don't understand that it wasn't logic that guided you, it was survival. You weren't trying to destroy, you were trying to soften the blow you believed was inevitable. You start to wonder if you're doomed to repeat this, if everything good will eventually die at your hands, if you're just that kind of person. But you're not, you're just afraid, and fear, when unspoken, becomes sabotage, not because it wants to, but because it doesn't know how else to move. But the loop can be broken, not by force, not by willpower, but by recognition. You start by noticing the moment it begins, the moment joy turns to anxiety, closeness turns tea. Oh threat, you pause, you breathe, you ask, what am I protecting right now? You begin to name the fear before it becomes behavior. You speak it out loud even if your voice shakes. You say, this matters to me and that terrifies me. And if the person stays, if the job holds, if the moment lasts, you let it. You won't always succeed. Some things will still slip through your hands. But over time, you start to believe that maybe not everything has to be lost to be safe. Because the truth is, sabotage is a kind of grief in advance. And healing is learning to stay anyway. Can you let yourself keep what you love without trying to protect yourself from its ending? The recognition void is what happens when you receive the praise you've always wanted, but it no longer reaches you, when people finally see you, applaud you, value you, but inside there's nothing. No satisfaction, no pride, no sense that you've arrived. You smile, you say thank you, you nod politely at compliments, but the truth is it doesn't land, it doesn't fill you. It floats somewhere above your head like light passing through glass. Because even though the world says you've made it, you still don't believe it. Or worse, you don't feel it. It begins with effort, with long years of striving. You work, improve, perform, not just to succeed, but to be seen. Maybe you tell yourself it's for the craft or the discipline or the mission, but deep down, part of you wants proof that you matter. You want someone to notice the weight you carry, the things you've overcome, the skill you've built in silence. You want someone to say, I see you. And eventually someone does, maybe many do. The recognition comes, public or private, loud or subtle. It arrives, but something's wrong. Instead of relief, there's emptiness. Instead of celebration, there's confusion. This is the paradox that you get what you always thought would fix you and nothing changes. You hear the applause, but it doesn't echo inside you. You read the messages, but they feel like they're written to someone else. You achieve something measurable, maybe even impressive, but the feeling of unworthiness lingers like a shadow that no spotlight can erase. You start to wonder, wasn't this supposed to help? Wasn't this the point? You try to explain it, but most people don't understand. They assume gratitude cures emptiness. That success ends doubt. That visibility means peace. But you know better. You know that being seen is not the same as being understood. That being praised is not the same as being believed in. That recognition, if it lands on a foundation of self-doubt, only sharpens the contrast between what others see and how you feel. So you start performing more, not out of arrogance but desperation. You think, maybe if I do more it will finally feel real. Maybe if I exceed expectations, the voice in my head will quiet. Maybe if I prove myself enough times, I'll start believing what they already do. You chase validation not to feed your ego, but to find evidence that you're not a fraud. But the evidence never sticks. You achieve and the bar moves. You succeed and the voice says it was luck. You receive love and the voice asks if they really mean it. You become a prisoner of your own potential, never free, always trying to earn what you've already been given. You begin to distrust the praise. You analyze it, dismantle it, search for insincerity. You start believing that if people truly knew you, knew the moments of weakness, the flaws you hide, the private mess beneath the polished surface, they'd take it all back. And so the more you're recognized, the more you're terrified of exposure. You smile for photos, give the speech, accept the award, publish the work, but inside you're waiting for it all to collapse. This doesn't mean you're broken, it means you've confused achievement with healing. That's what the world teaches, that if you do enough, become enough, prove enough, you'll finally feel whole. But wholeness doesn't come from recognition, it comes from reconciliation, with the parts of yourself you've tried to outperform, with the wounds you've tried to bury beneath trophies and titles, with the voice inside that learned to survive through perfection and performance. Eventually, you reach a strange kind of exhaustion, not physical but emotional, a tiredness that doesn't go away with rest. You start to see the cycle. You begin to understand that no amount of applause can soothe a mind that doesn't trust itself. You realize that every compliment is being filtered through years of internal rejection, that before you can receive, you have to unlearn the belief that you are undeserving. But unlearning is slow. It doesn't happen because someone tells you you're worthy. It happens when you stay with the discomfort, when you notice the praise and resist the urge to dismiss it, when you feel the impulse to work harder and ask instead, what would it mean to rest here? What would it mean to let this be enough? You begin to treat recognition not as medicine but as mirror, not as a cure but as a reflection. And slowly, you stop asking the world to prove your value. You start building that proof from within. You stop chasing the echo and start listening to the quiet. You stop performing for love and start noticing where it already exists. The recognition doesn't vanish, but it no longer defines you. It becomes something you can appreciate without needing, something you can accept without collapsing under, something you can carry lightly without fear of dropping. Because you've realized that what you needed wasn't to be seen by others, it was to stop hiding from yourself. If everyone says you've made it, what would it take for you to believe them? The intimacy-freedom clash is what happens when the very thing that makes you feel safe begins to make you feel trapped, when the closeness you long for becomes the boundary you push against, and when every step into deeper connection threatens the part of you that still needs to breathe alone. You want to be known fully, deeply, without condition, but you also want space, privacy, the quiet dignity of your own separate world. You want to wake up next to someone and still feel like you belong to yourself. You want to be vulnerable without becoming dependent, and this conflict is not selfishness, it is not confusion, it is the paradox of needing two things that pull in opposite directions at the same time. It begins the moment the relationship feels real. Maybe it's the first time someone says, "I love you," or the first time you're asked where this is going. Maybe it's something more subtle, sharing a drawer, a routine, a toothbrush. Whatever it is, it signals permanence. It signals and you want that, or at least you thought you did. But now that it's here, something in you starts to twitch. You feel watched, even when no one is watching. You feel weighed, even when no one is judging. You feel the shape of your identity beginning to bend, ever so slightly, around someone else's presence. And it scares you, not because you don't love them, but because you're not sure how much of yourself you can give without losing something essential. This is the paradox, that you feel most alive when you are close to someone, but also most alert, most tense, most self-conscious. You miss them when they're gone, but when they're near too long, you begin to feel suffocated. You crave their attention, but flinch when it becomes routine. You want them to need you, but not too much. You want to need them, but not to the point where it makes you vulnerable to their absence. And so you oscillate, between merging and pulling away, between warmth and withdrawal, between leaning in and shutting down. This isn't commitment phobia. This isn't emotional immaturity. It's the result of two equally legitimate psychological needs colliding inside you: the need for intimacy and the need for autonomy, the need to belong and the need to remain sovereign. Most people lean slightly toward one or the other, but when both needs are equally strong, the tension becomes constant. You are always choosing. Every word you share feels like a tiny surrender. Every compromise, no matter how small, feels like it might erase you. And yet, being alone too long feels hollow, incomplete, restless. You begin to feel that no matter which direction you move, you lose something vital. It doesn't help that society gives you only two models: enmeshment or avoidance. Be one half of a romantic ideal or remain proudly unattached. There's little room for relationships that breathe, that flex, that make space for both entanglement and distance. And so when you start pulling back, asking for space, setting limits, you fear being labeled cold, selfish, disloyal. You fear that needing time alone will be misread as rejection, that protecting your inner world will be taken as a wall. And so you stay close longer than you should. You answer messages even when your body needs silence. You show up smiling even when you feel overwhelmed. And little by little, your own needs start to feel like threats to the relationship rather than expressions within it. Eventually, the pressure builds, not dramatically, but slowly. You begin to fantasize about escape, not because you want someone else, but because you want yourself back. The version of you that wasn't always available, always responding, always seen. You long for solitude, not to get away from your partner, but to remember who you are when no one else is in the room. And when you finally take that space, if you do, it feels like exhaling after holding your breath for weeks. But then the guilt sets in, the voice that says, if you loved them, you wouldn't need this. That tells you real love means merging. That makes you question whether you're even capable of the intimacy you say you want. You begin to wonder if you're broken, if you're too complicated to love, if you're destined to push away every good thing that comes too close. But you're not broken, you're just someone whose soul doesn't like cages, no matter how beautiful. You're someone who can love fully and still crave separation, who can commit without dissolving, who can share life without surrendering your entire inner terrain. And the challenge is not in choosing one side, but in learning how to live with both without turning them into enemies. That means learning to communicate what feels like contradiction, telling your partner, I need space right now, not because I'm pulling away, but because I want to come back as myself. It means redefining what closeness looks like. It's not always about frequency. Sometimes it's about respect, about letting each other be whole people even when deeply connected, about knowing that love doesn't die in silence, it breathes in it. And it means learning to trust that your need for freedom is not a threat to your love, but a condition for its survival. Because when intimacy requires erasing yourself, it stops being connection and becomes consumption. And when freedom requires total disconnection, it stops being autonomy and becomes exile. But between those two extremes is a tension worth holding, a dance worth learning, a relationship worth creating, not by choosing one need over the other, but by building a life that honors both. Can you stay close without disappearing? Sleep trap is what happens when your body begs for rest, but your mind won't allow it, when exhaustion is present in every muscle, every breath, every part of your being, but the moment your head touches the pillow, your brain begins to accelerate. You close your eyes hoping for stillness, but instead you find noise. Thoughts you ignored during the day begin to speak all at once, tasks resurface, regrets replay, conversations rewind. You feel tired beyond measure, but now somehow you're wide awake. This is not insomnia in the medical sense, it's a psychological trap, a loop built from stress and sustained by guilt. You cannot sleep because you are stressed, and you are stressed because you haven't slept. The more you try to rest, the more effort you apply, the more awake you feel. And subtly, maybe it's just one night. You went to bed late thinking you'd fall asleep quickly, but instead you lie there fully aware of every thought, every sound, every shift in position. The next day you're tired, more tired than you expected. You tell yourself it's fine, that you'll catch up the next night. But the next night you're anxious, not because of the events of the day, but because of what you know is coming. You're afraid you won't sleep again. And that fear becomes the thing that keeps you awake. The bed becomes a stage, the pillow becomes a test. Your heart beats louder in the dark, your breathing becomes intentional. The room, though silent, grows tense. And sleep, the most natural thing in the world, becomes something you have to achieve. That's when the loop takes hold. You begin monitoring yourself, you track your sleep, you count the hours, you calculate how bad tomorrow will be if you don't fall asleep right now. You build pressure with every minute. Midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., you know your alarm is coming. You know your responsibilities don't care if you're rested. And that knowledge, instead of calming you, panics you. You think about performance, about energy, about how irritable or slow or sad you'll be tomorrow. You might even try to force sleep, by sheer will, by supplements, by rituals. You dim lights, you avoid screens, you play sounds of oceans or rain, but nothing changes the fact that your mind has begun to associate the act of sleeping with the fear of not being able to. And the fear is what keeps you awake. It's not just a matter of restlessness, it becomes identity. You start to think of yourself as someone who can't sleep. You say it out loud, you prepare for it, you cancel plans just in case you're exhausted again. You look at people who fall asleep effortlessly with confusion or envy. You might even grow resentful not at others but at yourself. You know your body needs rest. You feel the ache in your limbs, the pressure behind your eyes, the fog in your thoughts. But the command to sleep only tightens the loop, because you can't force surrender, you can't demand stillness. And that's what sleep is, a surrender, an act of letting go, not of control but of permission. And here's the deeper problem. Sleep is not just about biology, it's about safety. Your body will not enter rest if your mind does not feel safe. And safety isn't just physical, it's emotional, psychological, existential. If your day is filled with unresolved stress, with conflict, with suppressed feelings, with avoidance, then your mind will try to process them at night, because that's the first moment it gets your full attention. And once it does, you become overwhelmed. Not because the thoughts are new, but because you've kept them at bay until now. You start to see the pattern: days of distraction followed by nights of overthinking, constant action followed by frozen paralysis in the dark, and no matter how much you prepare your environment, you haven't prepared your mind. You've told yourself to relax, but you haven't told yourself how. You haven't dealt with the unresolved tension, the guilt, the tasks, the grief, the decisions postponed. And so they gather in your subconscious like clutter in a room. You try to lie down, but there's no space to rest. The tragedy of the sleep trap is that it turns recovery into effort. It makes you work for something that should be natural. You begin to dread bedtime, not because of nightmares, but because of the hours of waiting. You check the clock compulsively. You change positions like shifting will reset your brain, and the harder you try, the further it slips away. You think sleep is the reward for exhaustion, but now it feels like punishment. People give you advice. They tell you to exercise more, to drink tea, to write down your thoughts, and sometimes these things help. But most of the time, they treat the symptom, not the source, because the source isn't the absence of sleep, it's the presence of pressure. You've created a relationship with rest that is conditional on achievement, on timing, on being the right kind of tired, but rest is not something you earn, it's something you allow. And the loop can only begin to unwind when you stop negotiating with it, when you stop trying to fall asleep and instead focus on feeling safe in wakefulness. That means creating a space where you are allowed to lie awake without punishment, where you stop labeling a sleepless night as a failure, where you let yourself just be in the quiet, even if it's not what you wanted. That's when your nervous system starts to recalibrate. That's when the bed stops being a battleground. That's when your body stops bracing for disappointment. You begin to understand that sleep is not a task to complete, but a state you enter when the inner alarms are finally quiet, and those alarms are not turned off by force. They are soothed by trust, by repetition, by letting go of the need to achieve rest and instead letting yourself return to it slowly, gently, without expectation. The sleep trap isn't about sleep at all. It's about the fear that you're never doing enough, even when you're trying to do nothing. Can you let yourself rest without needing to succeed at it? The past-future loop is what happens when your entire mental life takes place in two timelines that never meet, when you spend your days analyzing the past to avoid making the same mistakes, while simultaneously projecting into the future in search of a version of yourself that finally feels whole. You believe you're doing the right thing, learning from experience, planning ahead, staying vigilant. But what you're actually doing is skipping the only place where life ever happens, the present. You replay what you said yesterday and rehearse what you'll say tomorrow. You rewrite old memories to fix them, and you simulate possible futures to control them. And while your mind travels back and forth, the current moment remains untouched, unlived, unseen. It starts innocently. Maybe you made a mistake, one that hurt someone. Maybe you lost an opportunity, said the wrong thing, trusted the wrong person. So you go back, you analyze, you relive the conversation frame by frame, tone by tone, trying to understand what you missed. If you had just said something else, just walked away, just waited a little longer. You begin to re-edit the memory like a film director not satisfied with the scene. The problem is, the scene already happened. You're not fixing it, you're haunting it, and that haunting becomes a habit. From the past, you jump to the future. Now that you've learned, you prepare. You make plans, strategies, backup strategies. You picture how the meeting will go, how the date will unfold, how the next version of you will behave. This projection gives you a sense of control. You tell yourself you're being responsible, proactive, wise, but in truth, you're building a blueprint on top of a moment that hasn't even arrived yet. And when it does, it rarely looks the way you expected. The person reacts differently. The circumstances shift. you forget your script, and now you're back in the past trying to figure out where it went wrong. This is the loop: past, future, always searching, always correcting, always anticipating, but never fully experiencing, never actually being in the only timeline that allows change, intimacy, presence, peace. The present becomes a corridor you walk through without looking around. You check your phone while eating. You think of your to-do list while talking. You listen while preparing your response. You exist, but you do not inhabit. You breathe, but shallowly. You feel, but distantly. And this has a cost. You start to feel like your life is passing without ever really touching you. Days go by, but you don't remember them. You see photos and realize you don't recall the moment they captured. You talk about events that felt important but feel no connection to them now, not because they weren't meaningful, but because you were somewhere else when they happened. You were in yesterday's apology or tomorrow's success, but not here, not in the laugh, not in the look, not in the breath. The worst part is that it feels productive. Ruminating on the past can look like insight. Planning the future can feel like growth, but in reality, both are avoidance. Avoidance of what is uncomfortable about now. Maybe it's uncertainty, maybe it's boredom, maybe it's the feeling that who you are at this moment isn't impressive or exciting or healed, so you leave, you jump into thought, you become a ghost in your own life. And it's not your fault. Modern life trains us to live this way, to reflect and optimize, to project and brand, to define our identities based on history and goals. Everything asks you, where have you been and where are you going? Almost nothing asks, where are you now? Not in a location sense, but in the deeper way. Where are you emotionally, mentally, spiritually? What are you noticing right now in this exact breath that doesn't belong to any story? You might try to meditate, you might try to slow down, but even mindfulness can become a tool for self-improvement rather than presence. You sit down to feel present so that you'll be calmer later, more focused later, more successful later. Even the now becomes a tool for the future, and the loop continues. Breaking it isn't about eliminating thought. The mind will wander, that's its nature. The key is noticing when the loop takes over, when the review of the past stops being insight and becomes punishment, when the vision of the future stops being direction and becomes pressure. You catch it gently, you say, there I go again, and you come back not with force but with kindness. You notice your feet, your hands, the light, the sound, anything, something. You begin to realize that the now is not just a pause between what was and what's coming. It's the only place where memory is transformed into wisdom and hope into action. It's where you laugh, where you love, where you grieve fully and heal honestly. It's the space where you remember that you're not just the sum of your mistakes or the outline of your ambitions. You are a breathing, sensing presence, not a timeline, a person. Eventually, the loop loses its grip. Not because you shut it down, but because you stop feeding it with urgency. You stop believing that the answers are back there or out ahead. You begin to trust that being here is not a compromise, it's the point. What if the life you're trying to fix or build is already happening right now, without you? The identity split is what happens when you become a different person depending on who you're with, when you adjust your tone, your expressions, your preferences so naturally that you don't even notice it until you're alone. And in that moment of silence, you feel a strange kind of disorientation. You wonder which version of you was real. The one who laughed louder than usual at the party, the one who stayed quiet in the meeting, the one who flirted playfully, or the one who avoided eye contact altogether. You carry so many versions of yourself that at some point, you stop knowing which one is you and which one is survival. It often begins innocently, maybe in childhood when you first learn that being liked means being safe. That approval comes from fitting in, pleasing others, not making things uncomfortable, so you begin to adjust. You become polite when adults are near. You become funny when friends are bored. You become quiet when someone is angry. And over time, you start to see these adaptations as identity, not because you're fake, but because they work. They protect you. They help you connect. But what begins as strategy becomes a habit. And that habit, over years, starts to erode your sense of who you really are when there's no one to perform for. In adolescence and early adulthood, it intensifies. Social circles multiply. The stakes get higher. You learn how to speak in the right tone for the right group. With one person, you're deep, reflective, emotionally open. With another, you're light, sarcastic, impenetrable. You shift posture, vocabulary, even values subtly, smoothly. And at first, it feels like flexibility, social intelligence, emotional fluency. But eventually, you begin to feel like a mirror with no reflection of its own. Someone who can reflect back what others want to see, but who lacks a center. This is the paradox that being able to become what others need makes you slowly lose touch with what you need. You're so used to adjusting that you forget how to stay still. And when someone asks you a direct question, what do you want? What do you believe? What do you feel? You pause, not because you're shy, but because you genuinely don't know. You start scanning for context, for clues, for what the right answer is in that moment. Because your answers are not drawn from internal truth, they're constructed on demand. People around you might never notice. To them, you seem easy to be with, adaptable, empathetic, non-threatening, but deep down you begin to feel hollow, not in a depressive sense but in a dislocated one. Like you're walking through life wearing outfits that others picked for you, saying lines you didn't write. You laugh and feel the laughter land on the outside of your chest. You say yes and feel the quiet no echo inside. And then you go home and try to decompress, but even in silence you don't find yourself. You find more noise. The problem isn't that you're false, it's that you're fragmented, that you've distributed your identity into too many rooms and now don't remember how to gather it again. Each version of you served a purpose. The professional one, the rebellious one, the calm one, the charismatic one, but taken together, they form a mosaic that no longer feels like a face. You start to long for someone who sees through all of it, someone who recognizes the thread between the versions, someone who doesn't get confused when you shift. But even if that person appears, they can't help you find what you've hidden from yourself. You might be honest with them, but if you don't know what your truth is, honesty becomes performance too. You can only be known to the extent that you know yourself, and that's what the identity split steals from you, the right to be real, not just responsive. This split doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's small, saying you're fine when you're not, laughing when something bothers you, agreeing with things just to keep the peace. But each moment is a tiny act of erasure, not enough to destroy you, but enough to dim the light just a bit, enough to make you forget your own contours. Over time, you may begin to seek out isolation, not because you're antisocial, but because you're trying to hear your own voice without interference. You cancel plans, avoid mirrors, turn off your phone, not to escape others, but to locate yourself. And sometimes you do, in brief flashes, in music, in writing, in a quiet walk where no one needs you to be anything but breathing. But those moments feel rare, fragile, like they'll evaporate the second someone else enters the room. So how do you repair it? How do you stitch yourself back together when you've been fragmented for so long? It begins with noticing, with slowing the transitions between masks, with catching yourself in the moment of adjusting and asking, who am I right now and why? It means practicing stillness not just in solitude but in interaction, saying something slightly more honest than why. Oh, normally would, disagreeing gently instead of nodding, speaking even when your voice shakes, letting someone see the parts of you that don't fit the room. It means building an identity not from reaction, but from reflection. Not from what others need, but from what endures in you no matter where you are. You begin to gather the pieces, you hold them all, not to reject the versions of yourself that helped you survive, but to bring them home. To remind them that they are all part of you, but none of them are all of you, because you're not a character in other people's stories. You're the author of your own. When no one else is around, you still recognize the person who shows up. The forgiveness paradox is what happens when letting go of what someone did to you feels like betraying yourself, when the pain they caused is still real, still alive, still shaping your days, and yet the only way forward is to release it. You want peace, but peace feels unfair. You want healing, but healing feels like erasure. So you sit in a strange middle space, not holding on out of hatred, but out of memory, out of self-respect, out of fear that if you let go too easily, the damage they caused becomes something smaller than it was. Forgiveness is often presented as the final step in a clean emotional sequence. Someone hurts you, you feel pain, time passes, you understand their motives, and then in a moment of emotional clarity you forgive. But real forgiveness rarely works like that. In reality, it comes in waves. You forgive in the morning and feel bitter again by night. You think you've moved on only to be triggered by a photo, a word, a smell. You feel generous one day and closed off the next. Forgiveness, in its real form, isn't a switch. It's a slow unraveling of something tightly wound, a thread that gets caught on every sharp edge you didn't know you were still carrying. And the paradox begins when that unraveling starts to feel like self-betrayal. You tell yourself you deserve to be angry, that your pain matters, that your silence is dignity, that remembering what they did is the only proof that it happened. Forgiveness then feels like letting them win, like letting them rewrite the story to make themselves the hero. You fear that if you forgive, you're telling yourself it didn't hurt, that it wasn't serious, that it didn't change you. But the truth is it did. That's the problem. That's why it's hard, because you were changed and no amount of words, apologies, or time can undo that. You carry the mark whether you forgive or not, and when you realize that, forgiveness starts to feel less like closure and more like surrender, like agreeing to live with the scar without asking for anything back, not justice, not understanding, not even acknowledgement. And still we are told that forgiveness is freedom, that it's the only way to be whole again, that bitterness poisons the one who holds it, not the one who caused it. But that assumes forgiveness is a choice we can make in isolation, that we are the only ones in the room. In reality, the memory of the one who hurt us stays close. Their voice echoes in your mind. Their absence fills the space. Forgiveness isn't done alone. It's done in the shadow of what they left behind. So you hesitate, you sit in the paradox. You want to let go but not forget. You want to heal but not dismiss. You want to be free but not lie to yourself. And every attempt to forgive feels like an internal contradiction, because you can't erase the truth to feel better, but you also can't carry it forever and still call that living. And sometimes the hardest part is that the person who hurt you doesn't even think about it anymore. They've moved on, they've justified themselves, they've rewritten their version of events, and you're the one left holding the weight, carrying the accountability for a moment they might barely remember. So when you forgive, you're not just letting go of the event, you're letting go of your demand that they understand it the way you do. And that's the real loss, not just what they did, but the part of you that still wants to be seen. Forgiveness in this paradox becomes an act of grieving. You grieve the apology you'll never hear, the understanding you'll never receive, the justice that never arrived. And in that grief, you start to see that forgiveness isn't about the other person at all. It's not even about moral high ground. It's about making peace with the fact that some pain will never be repaired and deciding that you don't want to spend your life proving how much it hurt. It's not about letting them off the hook. It's about letting yourself off the hook of needing them to fix it. That doesn't mean you forget. That doesn't mean you welcome them back. That doesn't mean you lie to yourself. It means you stop bleeding for a wound they're not even looking at anymore. And even then, it's not instant. Forgiveness comes slowly. One choice at a time, one morning where you don't rehearse the story again, one conversation you don't need to have, one breath where you remember what happened and feel it soften just a little, until one day the weight shifts. And then the paradox becomes something else entirely, because you forgave not to change the past, but to reclaim the future. So the question isn't whether they deserve forgiveness, it's whether you deserve to be free. The overthinking silence is what happens when you say nothing, not because you don't have words, but because you've already imagined every possible way they might be taken the wrong way. You play out the entire conversation in your head before a single sound escapes your mouth. You anticipate their reactions, rehearse your defenses, revise your tone, edit your message until there's nothing left but worry, and in that space of constant simulation, you choose silence. Not because you're calm, not because you're distant, but because the noise inside is already too loud. It starts small, a question left unanswered, a comment you don't reply to, a moment where you want to speak but hesitate. Maybe they said something that hurt. Maybe you want to explain how you feel. Maybe you just want to be understood. But as soon as the impulse to speak rises, so do the calculations. What if they misunderstand you? What if you sound dramatic? What if they use your words against you? What if it only makes things worse, so you hold it in and no one notices? They just see you being quiet. They don't see the storm behind your stillness. Overthinking is rarely loud. It's not the kind that shouts. It's the kind that waits, watches, and spirals. It analyzes tone, decodes timing, rewinds conversations like surveillance footage. It looks for signs, reads between lines that aren't there, and convinces you that silence is safer than being seen. Because being seen means being exposed, and exposure means vulnerability, and vulnerability means risk. And that, for someone who's been misunderstood too many times, feels unbearable. So you fall into the paradox. You want connection, but you stay silent. You want to explain, but you overanalyze. You want to be heard, but you're too afraid of being misheard. And each time you choose silence, the pressure builds. People start to think you're distant, disinterested, cold. But that's not the truth. The truth is, you've already had the conversation 100 times in your mind. You've played their part and yours. You've tried being kind, tried being firm, tried being honest, tried being indirect. And in every version it ends badly, so you say nothing, and they say nothing back. And now the silence becomes a wall. And over time that wall becomes a home. You live inside it. You furnish it with excuses. You decorate it with coping strategies. You tell yourself that no one would understand, that no one really listens, that it's better this way. But it's not. It's just quieter. And in that quiet, your thoughts get louder. Your doubts grow stronger. Your voice fades. Until eventually you forget how to say what you mean. Not because you've lost the words, but because you no longer trust them to matter. This is the cost of the overthinking silence. It steals the conversation before it begins. It replaces real connection with internal theater. It turns self-protection into self-isolation. And while it may feel like control, it's actually fear disguised as logic. You convince yourself that you're being wise, cautious, strategic. But really, you're just afraid to risk being misunderstood again. Because the last time you tried to explain, they didn't get it, or they twisted it. Or they made you feel small for trying. So now, silence feels like dignity, But it's not, it's just a different kind of suffering. And no one sees it, that's what makes it worse. They assume you're fine, that your quiet means peace. But inside, you're screaming through every unsent message, every unsaid truth, every conversation you never let happen. And the longer it goes on, the harder it is to break. Because now, speaking up feels not just risky, but foreign, like learning a language you once knew but haven't used in years. You start to wonder, would they even care if I spoke? Would they understand if I tried? Or have I already trained them to stop listening? And so the loop continues. Every silence becomes proof that you shouldn't speak. Every hesitation becomes validation for staying quiet, and the more you overthink, the more you undercommunicate, until eventually, the relationship dies not from conflict, but from everything that was never said. But here's the truth you don't want to face. Clarity never comes from silence. Connection never grows in the dark, and peace never arrives through avoidance. The overthinking silence feels safe because it shields you from immediate pain, but it also shields you from everything that could have gone right, from the apology that might have come, from the empathy that could have surprised you, from the closeness you never got to feel because you never let yourself be seen. So you have to ask yourself, is this silence protecting you, or is it burying you? Because eventually, all those unspoken thoughts become weight, and you either carry them forever or you find the courage to speak. And if your voice shakes, let it, but let it be heard. The sadness comfort is what happens when pain becomes so familiar, so integrated into your daily rhythm that it starts to feel like home. Not because it's pleasant, not because it's healing, but because it's predictable. You know its shape, its texture, its timing. You know what days it visits and what music it prefers. You know which corner of the bed it curls into and what thoughts it brings with it. And after a while, even when life gets better, you hesitate to let go of that sadness, not because you want it, but because you've learned how to live with it. It sounds irrational. Why would anyone cling to sadness? But comfort doesn't always come from joy. Sometimes it comes from familiarity. And sadness, especially the long, quiet kind, becomes a rhythm you trust. You wake up and there it is, not crushing, not dramatic, just present, like a weight you've learned to balance, like a shadow you've stopped trying to outrun. And even when happiness knocks on the door, part of you resists answering, because you don't know what happiness might take from you. Because you don't know if you're ready to live without the ache that's been keeping you company for so long. Maybe it started after a loss or a heartbreak or a betrayal that left you questioning your worth. And in the beginning, the sadness was loud. It broke you open, it rewrote your mornings. It made food taste dull and sleep feel distant. But over time, it changed. It settled. It grew quieter, more subtle. It didn't interrupt your days anymore. It blended into them. You still laughed. You still worked. You still showed up. But underneath it all, the sadness remained like a slow river beneath a frozen surface. Always moving, always there. And then something strange happens. You begin to associate that sadness with your identity. It becomes part of your story, part of your tone, your choices, your inner world. You shape your music playlists around it. You find art that reflects it. You speak in a rhythm that carries its cadence. And slowly, unconsciously, you build a life where sadness isn't just allowed, it's accommodated. You stop challenging it. You stop questioning whether it should be there, because at least it makes sense. At least it's yours. People notice, but they don't understand. They tell you to cheer up, to look on the bright side, to think positive, but none of that touches the real issue. The real issue isn't that you're unable to feel joy, it's that joy feels alien, unstable, unreal, because joy is fleeting. Joy can be taken, but sadness stays. It never betrays you with its absence. It never surprises you. It never makes promises it can't keep. It just stays. And in a world full of chaos, that constancy starts to feel like love. You tell yourself it's fine, that you're functioning, that you've moved on, but deep down you know you're still holding on to something that no longer serves you, a loss that should have faded, a wound that should have healed, a sorrow that should have passed, but you kept feeding it, naming it, inviting it back, and now it's woven into everything. The danger of the sadness comfort is that it tricks you into believing that healing is too risky. That letting go is betrayal, that if you stop being sad, you're forgetting something important, someone important, and so you keep the sadness close. You dress it in meaning, you mistake it for depth. You fear that without it you'll feel shallow, exposed, naive, but that's the trap. Sadness isn't depth, it's just density, and density can weigh you down until you forget how to rise. You can see this in others too. The friend who always brings conversations back to heartbreak, the artist who can't create unless they're in pain, The partner who pulls away the moment they start to feel happy, afraid they'll lose it. They're not weak, they're not broken, they're just afraid to let go of the sadness that once protected them. Because sadness at one point was a shield, it helped you process, it gave you space. It slowed the world down when everything felt too fast, but now it's a habit, a reflex, a mood you wear like old clothing, frayed, outdated but familiar, and every time you try to take it off you feel naked, exposed, vulnerable, so you put it back on and convince yourself it fits. But it doesn't, not anymore. The truth is you don't owe your pain anything. You can honor what you've been through without living inside it forever. You can carry memory without carrying the mood. You can heal without forgetting. You can smile without guilt. You can let go without losing the meaning. Because real healing isn't about erasing the sadness, it's about not needing it to feel real. So ask yourself gently, are you still sad because you're still hurting? Or are you still hurting because sadness is the only thing you know how to feel? Because eventually, the comfort becomes a cage, and staying there won't protect you. It will just keep you from the life that's Ying to grow beyond it. And maybe you're not afraid of healing, maybe you're afraid of who you'll be without the pain. The desire fatigue is what happens when you've wanted for so long, so deeply, so desperately, that wanting itself becomes exhausting. At first, desire is movement. It pushes you forward, gives you focus, gives you reason. You want a better life, a connection, a purpose, a place to belong. You work toward it, you dream about it, you build yourself around the chase, and for a while it feels like momentum. But over time, if that desire keeps going unfulfilled, if the things you crave keep slipping through your fingers, something inside you starts to wear down. Not just your hope, but your capacity to keep wanting. It's not that you give up, not entirely, you still care, you still think about what could be, but the desire no longer lifts you, it drains you. The excitement becomes weight, the hope becomes pressure, and the more you want, the more you feel the absence of what you don't have. It becomes a kind of emotional erosion, a slow grinding of your motivation, your clarity, your sense of worth, until one day you realize you're not chasing the dream anymore, you're just dragging it behind you. This is what makes desire dangerous, not the wanting itself, but the timeline. Human beings can carry hope, but only for so long without reinforcement. If what you want doesn't come, if the dream doesn't meet you halfway, your desire begins to collapse inward. You question your own judgment. You start to wonder if you were naive, foolish, unrealistic. You tell yourself to lower your standards, to want less, to numb the edge. And eventually, you stop chasing not because you don't care, but because you're too tired to care loudly. Maybe you felt this with love. You used to want a partner who sees you fully, who matches your depth, who moves through the world with the same fire. But after years of almosts, of miscommunications, of one-sided effort, the idea of love becomes less romantic and more exhausting. You still crave connection, but the process of finding it feels like emotional labor you can't afford anymore. So you shrink your desire. You make peace with being misunderstood. You stop expecting to be met where you are. Or maybe it's your work, you had a vision. You poured your energy into a goal, a business, a dream project, and for years you fought, you believed. You stayed up late convincing yourself it was all worth it, but the world didn't reward you on time. And now even when opportunities come, even when a window cracks open, you hesitate, not because you don't want it, but because you no longer trust your own momentum. Desire, once electric, now feels like friction. You remember what it cost you last time. This isn't laziness, it's psychological fatigue. When the nervous system is placed in prolonged anticipation without satisfaction, it adapts. It stops sending the signals of urgency. It slows down the emotional circuits. It numbs you not because you've lost ambition, but because it's trying to protect you from burnout, from despair, from another cycle of hope without result. The worst part is that no one sees this happening. From the outside, you still look functional, you still smile, you still say the right things, but inside the engine is quieter, the flame is lower. You don't leap at chances the way you used to. You don't fantasize with the same hunger. You're not pessimistic, but you're not wide-eyed either. You've become strategic with your dreaming, selective, and eventually avoidant. And that's the loop. Desire leads to effort. Effort leads to delay. Delay leads to fatigue. Fatigue leads to apathy. Apathy leads to guilt, and guilt reignites desire, but now with less joy and more fear. You start asking dangerous questions. Do I even know what I want anymore? Have I been chasing the wrong thing? Is this all there is? You don't realize how much energy desire requires until you no longer have it, until every new goal feels like a burden, until even rest feels undeserved because you're not actively striving, until the only thing more painful than not getting what you want is being too tired to want it at all. Philosophers talk about the hedonic treadmill, the idea that we keep moving toward new desires even after achieving old ones. But this is something darker. This is when you stay on the treadmill long enough for your legs to give out, when your mind still wants to run, but your body refuses, when your dreams aren't dead, but they're too heavy to carry. And then something strange happens. You start admiring people who want less, who live simply, who are content, not because you've found peace, but because you envy their freedom from the emotional labor of wanting. You look at them and think, maybe they're smarter, maybe they were right all along. But you weren't wrong for wanting more. You weren't wrong for dreaming big. You weren't wrong for holding out for something meaningful. The problem isn't the size of your desire, it's the weight of your disappointment. So what now? You can't just night desire by force. That's not how it works. You can't fake hunger, but you can rest. You can stop measuring your worth by how much you strive. You can let yourself feel the sadness without trying to fix it. You can remind yourself that fatigue is not failure, that you're not broken, you're just tired, and tired people don't need motivation, they need time. Because desire, real desire, only comes back when you stop punishing yourself for losing it. And maybe one day, when you're no longer chasing to prove anything, when you're no longer addicted to the reward, you'll feel a flicker again. A quiet, innocent spark, not ambition, not desperation, just curiosity, just play, just the gentle ache of wanting, not because you need something, but because you're ready again. And that's how desire heals, not with fire, but with rest. The social mask is what happens when the version of you that other people love becomes a character too hard to take off. It starts small, as all masks do, not with lies, but with adjustments. You make yourself more polite, more agreeable, more competent, more fun. You don't mean to be fake, you just want to connect. So you amplify the parts of yourself that people seem to like, and you mute the rest. You smile when you're tired, you joke when you're sad, you nod when you disagree, and after a while, that curated version of you, the socially optimized self, becomes your public identity. It's not dishonest, exactly. It's just not the whole story. At first it works, people respond well, you're invited, included, celebrated. They compliment your energy, your charisma, your strength. They don't know that energy costs you. They don't see the silence that follows. They don't ask about the parts you left outside, and maybe you're relieved they don't, because keeping the mask on feels safer than risking the confusion or rejection of showing what's underneath. You tell yourself it's just easier this way, but with time, you forget what this way actually is. The mask stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like your face. The danger of the social mask isn't that it fools others, it's that it starts to fool you. You begin to measure your worth by how well you maintain the performance. You monitor your tone, your reactions, your moods. You try to be predictable, manageable, likable, and somewhere along the way, your real self, the one that feels, stumbles, disagrees, gets overwhelmed, starts to feel like a liability. So you hide it, not just from others, but from yourself. Maybe you've been in a room full of people laughing, and you're laughing too, but you feel like you're floating outside your body. You're performing joy and doing it well, but it doesn't touch you. It doesn't land. Or maybe someone says, "You're so strong," and you say, "Thanks," but all you want to do is cry, because strength wasn't what you needed, it was what you performed to be loved. And the longer this goes on, the harder it gets to reconnect with who you were before the mask. You start forgetting what you actually enjoy. You find yourself asking questions like, am I this calm, or have I just learned not to show emotion? Do I really love helping people, or is that just how I make myself useful? Am I confident, or just afraid of looking weak? Eventually, the mask becomes a prison. People don't check in on you because they think you're fine. They don't ask deeper questions because they don't sense anything wrong. But you feel it when you're alone, when the performance ends, when the silence returns, that aching gap between how others see you and who you really are. The paradox is brutal. The better you are at playing the role, the less likely anyone is to see the pain behind it. You become invisible inside your own performance. And the more you succeed socially, the more isolated you feel emotionally, because no one can love the parts of you they never see. There's also guilt. You tell yourself you're ungrateful, that people are kind to you, that they admire you, that they trust you, so you must be fine, you must be okay, you must not complain. But deep down, you know that what they admire is only half of you, sometimes less. And that's what hurts the most, not that people don't love you, but that they love a version of you that isn't allowed to fall apart. That isn't allowed to doubt. That isn't allowed to need, so what do? You can't just rip the mask off, it's not that simple. The mask is functional, it protects you. It got you through school, through work, through breakups, through grief. It gave you control in moments when vulnerability would have been dangerous. You wore it because you had to. But now maybe you don't have to anymore. Now maybe you want something else, something riskier, not admiration, not applause, just being known. To be seen without performance, to be loved without effort, to cry without apology, to disappoint someone and not be abandoned, to be boring or anxious or complicated and still be enough. That doesn't mean dropping the mask forever. It just means learning to take it off with the right people, with people who don't need you to be on all the time, people who ask you questions you don't have to answer perfectly, people who aren't impressed by the mask because they're already reaching for the person underneath. It also means doing the terrifying work of reconnecting with your real self, listening to your own silences, letting yourself be angry, sad, excited, confused without editing, letting yourself say, I don't know, letting yourself be quiet in a room and not feel like you're disappearing, letting yourself feel joy that isn't performative, grief that isn't poetic, rest that isn't earned. Because the truth is, the social mask will never love you back. It will keep you admire. But never fulfilled. It will keep you safe but never close. It will keep you visible but never known. And if you keep wearing it too long, one day you'll wake up and realize that you're surrounded by people who love your performance, but no one even knows who's wearing it. And in that moment, the question becomes, do you want to be loved or do you want to be real? The help refusal paradox is what happens when the very thing you need most, help, feels impossible to accept. It begins with a moment of quiet struggle, something small, something manageable. You tell yourself you'll figure it out, that you don't want to bother anyone, that you're just tired, that you're used to it, and maybe you are, so you carry it. You carry the stress, the fear, the weight of everything that's going wrong, not because you believe you deserve it, but because asking someone else to carry even a piece of it feels somehow worse than the pain itself. You convince yourself you're just being strong, that everyone has problems, that others have it worse. And besides, you've always managed. You've survived other storms, so you'll survive this one. You tell yourself that asking for help would mean giving up, that it would mean becoming a burden, that it would expose just how badly you're really doing. And that thought is unbearable, because somewhere deep down you fear that if people saw how much you're holding back, they might back away. Not because they're cruel, but because you've built a life around being capable, around being the one who helps, not the one who needs. So you smile, you nod, you say, I'm fine, even when you're drowning. The paradox is cruel. The worse things get, the more you need help and the harder it becomes to ask. Because with every day that passes, the silence grows heavier, the performance becomes more practiced, and the people around you who might have once seen through it now believe the version you've sold them. The strong one, the resilient one, the one who never cracks. And you hate that version sometimes. You hate how well it's working, you hate that people believe it, but you also can't imagine showing them anything else. Because what if they don't know what to do with it? What if they freeze? What if they say the wrong thing? Or worse, what if they say nothing, so you hold it in? Maybe you've been in a conversation where someone asked, how are you really? And you wanted to answer honestly. You wanted to say, not good, I'm overwhelmed, I feel alone, I'm scared. But instead you smiled again, changed the subject, laughed, because it was easier than watching someone panic in front of your truth, because it was safer than hearing empty reassurances or well-meaning advice that only made you feel more misunderstood. And that's what no one talks about, how hard it is to be helped, how much vulnerability it takes not just to be seen, but to stay seen, how much courage it takes to say, yes, I'm not okay, and not rush to soften it, not add, but I'll be fine, not apologize for feeling what you feel. Because when you've spent years being the strong one, the reliable one, the self-sufficient one, accepting help can feel like failure. It can feel like collapse, like shame. But here's the truth, help isn't weakness. Asking for support isn't surrendering your dignity, it's honoring your limits. It's recognizing that strength isn't measured by how much you can endure in silence, but by how honest you're willing to be with your pain. Still knowing that doesn't make it easier. Because even when someone offers help sincerely, part of you pulls back, not out of pride, but out of fear. What if they don't really mean it? What if they regret it? What if they see you differently afterward? What if they help now but leave later? And sometimes you don't just fear being helped, you fear needing it again, you fear becoming dependent, you fear forming a bond that makes you vulnerable to future absence. Because when people become your lifeline, their departure becomes your collapse. So the safer option, the cleaner option, the one that hurts quietly and predictably, is to refuse help, to carry the weight alone, to collapse privately, because at least then the pain is yours. At least then you're not disappointed by someone else's limits, but over time, that logic eats you alive. Because you don't just lose support, you lose connection. You isolate yourself behind walls you never meant to build. You drift away from the people who might have understood, who might have helped, who might have loved the broken, tired, imperfect version of you if only they'd been given the chance. And that's what this paradox reveals. Refusing help isn't always an act of pride. Sometimes it's an act of protection. Sometimes it's what you do when you've been hurt before, when you've trusted and been abandoned, when you've opened up and been met with silence, or solutions, or judgment, or averted eyes so you stop asking. But that decision comes at a cost, because while independence feels noble, it often becomes a cage. You convince yourself that survival is enough, that not falling apart in front of people is a victory, but you know better. You know that surviving isn't the same as living, that coping isn't the same as healing, that endurance isn't the same as connection, and yet you still he's. Because letting someone help means letting them see the parts of you that feel unworthy of help. The mess, the fear, the failure, the things you think make you hard to love, the things you wish you could fix before anyone saw, but maybe the only way to heal those parts is to let them be seen first. Maybe help isn't just about solutions, maybe it's about presence. Maybe it's about someone sitting next to you in the dark, not trying to pull you out, not trying to fix it, just being there, quietly, steadily, refusing to leave. And maybe that's the kind of help you need most, not advice, not rescue. Just someone who sees you drowning and says, "You don't have to explain, I'll sit with you until you can breathe again." And maybe, in the end, the only way out of the help refusal paradox is to believe that someone, somewhere, would stay, even after you stop pretending you're okay. The productivity burnout paradox is what happens when the more you try to achieve, the less alive you feel. It begins with ambition, with the desire to grow, to become more, to make something of yourself. You start small, checking off tasks, staying late, saying yes to opportunities. You feel good when you're busy. You feel purposeful. Until one day, without warning, the same things that once gave you a sense of momentum start to feel like suffocation. You wake up tired even after sleep, stare at a to-do list that used to excite you and feel numb. You go through the motions, meet deadlines, hit goals, but the satisfaction is gone. You cross the finish line and feel nothing. No celebration, no pride, just another task waiting. Another responsibility you can't skip. You keep going because stopping would mean confronting something scarier, the thought that you've built your entire worth on being useful. That's the core of the paradox. You chase productivity to feel valuable, but the more you chase it, the more it consumes the parts of you that had value to begin with. Your curiosity, your creativity, your joy, your spontaneity, they all shrink under the weight of efficiency. You become a machine running on systems, sleep schedules, and performance metrics. And when the machine breaks down, you don't rest. You blame yourself for not being stronger. At some point, you stop asking how you feel. You only ask how much you've done. Even your rest becomes strategic. I'll take a break so I can perform better tomorrow. Even leisure becomes calculated. I'll read this book to become smarter. Even human connection becomes a box to check. I need to call my friend so I'm not a bad person. The purpose behind everything is output. And the moment anything stops being productive, it feels like a threat. You forget how to enjoy things that serve no purpose. You look at people who can sit and do nothing without guilt, and you envy them, but you also don't understand them, because somewhere along the way you learn that being still is dangerous, that it makes you lazy, that it makes you fall behind. So you keep going, even when your body protests, even when your mind blurs, even when your soul begins to whisper, "Please stop." And you wonder, why do you feel like a failure even when you're winning? Maybe it's because you've confused movement with growth, completion with meaning, hustle with worth, but real growth isn't frantic, it's slow, it's rooted, it needs space. And you've given yourself none, because in the world you've built, doing nothing feels like being nothing, so you avoid it. You fill every empty space with work, and when there's no more work, you create more. You say yes to every favor, every request, every challenge, until your yes means nothing because you're too exhausted to give it fully. And the world rewards you for it. It applauds your drive, your resilience, your grind. It tells you you're inspiring, that you're an example, and part of you takes pride in that. But another part, the part you buried, starts to ache, because you know it's unsustainable. You know you're running on fumes. You know you've been performing a version of yourself that looks strong but feels hollow. That's the burnout. It's not a fire that consumes you all at once. It's a slow erosion, a quiet draining of color. You don't collapse, you fade. Your laugh becomes quieter, your spark becomes routine, your energy becomes borrowed time, and still you don't stop. Because stopping feels like failure, like letting people down, like becoming invisible, like admitting that maybe, just maybe, you've been running not toward something, but away from something, away from stillness, from grief, from boredom, from feelings you don't have time to feel. That's why burnout is so hard to fix, because the problem isn't the workload, it's the identity. You don't just work a lot, you are the work, you are the output, you are the overachiever, the high performer, the dependable one. And when you stop producing, you don't know who you are, so you push through, again and again. Until your body intervenes, until your mind shuts down, until you cry for no reason, snap at people you love, lose focus, lose joy, lose yourself. And even then you might not rest, you might still try to push. You might whisper, I can't afford to stop, even though the truth is, you can't afford not to. The paradox is that what once gave you strength is now draining it. What once felt like self-discipline now feels like self-punishment. And the only way out is to question the very foundation you built yourself on. You have to ask what you're chasing. And why are you trying to prove something? To whom? Are you afraid of being still, of being ordinary? Do you believe that if you stop achieving, people will stop loving you? These are not easy questions. They demand a kind of honesty that hurts, but they're the only questions that matter when burnout becomes your normal. Cause the real danger isn't exhaustion, it's disconnection. From your body, from your emotions, from your desires, from the version of yourself that existed before you were told your value depended on how much you could do. And maybe, just maybe, the most productive thing you could do now is nothing. To rest not as a means to work better, but as a form of self-respect. To say no, not because you're overwhelmed, but because your peace matters more than your pace. To stop, even briefly, and let yourself be human again. Because if the machine you've built your life around is breaking you, maybe you weren't meant to be a machine in the first place. The love-hurt equation begins with a truth no one wants to admit. Only the people you love can truly break you. Not strangers, not enemies, just the ones you let in. The closer they are, the deeper they can cut. That's the equation. The more something means to you, the more pain it can cause. The more you love, the more you risk. And that's not an accident, it's structural. Love and pain aren't opposites. They're connected. Love creates the vulnerability that pain needs in order to exist. Imagine someone entering a relationship for the first time. They feel safe. Seen, understood, every conversation feels like discovery. Every glance carries meaning. For a while, everything fits. But then slowly it changes. A comment lands wrong. A message is ignored. Distance forms almost invisibly. And when it ends, it doesn't end like a door slamming shut. It ends like oxygen thinning. They can't breathe. Not because they lost something, but because something that once gave them life now feels like suffocation. That's when they realize the truth. The very thing that made them feel most alive is the thing that now hurts the most. This isn't an accident of emotion, it's a logical structure. Pain follows love not as punishment, but as consequence. When you care about someone, you tie their actions to your well-being. What they do matters. Their silence hurts, their approval uplifts, their betrayal devastates. You hand them a piece of your internal world and trust they won't crush it. And most of the time, they don't mean to, but even accidents leave scars. The people who hurt you the most often never intended to. They just mattered. That's all it takes. This is where the paradox begins. Love is supposed to be healing, not harmful. We reach for it because it gives us a sense of connection, a sense of purpose. But that connection comes with a cost. When you love someone, you're not just saying, you make me happy. You're saying, I'm giving you access to the part of me that no one else gets to touch. And that access, by definition, comes with risk. Risk of disappointment, risk of loss, risk of being seen and still left. We tell ourselves that love is worth it, that the joy outweighs the pain, but that's not always true. For some people, the pain reshapes them. A broken trust, an unexpected betrayal, a quiet withdrawal. These don't just hurt, they change how you see yourself, how you trust, how you hope. And yet we return to love again and again. Why? Because without it, nothing matters. That's the second layer of the paradox. Love doesn't just make you vulnerable, it gives life meaning. It's the filter through which we experience depth. Art, music, family, friendship, none of it matters without some form of love. But the more meaning it carries, the more damage it can do. You can't have one without the other, that's the equation. Love expands your emotional capacity, which means it also expands your capacity for pain. Think about how this works over time. A child learns to love their parent, they depend on them, look up to them, trust them. But if that parent is inconsistent, dismissive, or cruel, the pain becomes foundational, not just hurtful, formative. That child learns that love is unstable, that care can vanish, that closeness is dangerous, and that lesson becomes a blueprint for future relationships. They either avoid intimacy or cling to it too tightly. Either way, the pain echoes forward. Love didn't just open them up, it rewired them. This is why people fear love even if they don't admit it, not because it's weak, but because it's powerful. It forces exposure. It dissolves boundaries. It says, here I am without armor. And once that armor is gone, anything can happen. They might hold you gently, or they might drop you. Either way, the outcome is no longer in your control. Control is another part of the equation. When you love someone, you surrender a degree of control. You place emotional power in their hands. That's not a flaw, it's the mechanism. You can't love from a distance, not truly. Love requires surrender, but surrender means risk, and risk means pain is always possible, sometimes inevitable. This brings up an uncomfortable question. If love and hurt are so tightly linked, is it possible to love without risking devastation? Can you protect yourself and still feel fully? Some try. They build walls, keep people at arm's length, maintain independence at all costs. But those same people often feel hollow, because protection without connection isn't safety, it's isolation. The heart wasn't built to survive on autonomy alone, it was built for connection. And connection, by design, opens the door to loss. Philosophers and psychologists have tried to solve this. They suggest healthy boundaries, secure attachment styles, self-love, and these help, but they don't change the structure. The paradox remains. Even in the healthiest relationship, even with the best intentions, love still carries the power to wound. Why? Because no human is perfect, and no bond is immune to miscommunication, stress, distance, or change. The pain isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just neglect, or forgetting, or changing faster than the other person can follow, but even that can break something. And when it breaks, it doesn't just hurt, it destabilizes identity. If someone you love walks away, you don't just lose them, you lose the version of yourself that existed with them. The jokes only they understood, the habits you built together, the little routines, all gone, and what's left is silence. Not just external silence, but internal, a kind of emotional vacuum where something used to be. That space echoes. It reminds you that something once mattered and now doesn't. This is the shadow side of love, not cruelty, not betrayal, just absence, indifference, distance, and that might hurt more than anything else. Because pain at least means something still matters. Indifference means it doesn't. And realizing that someone no longer feels what you still do, that's where the equation goes from logical to unbearable, and yet we love again. Despite the risk, despite the math, despite the memories, we open up, we trust, we hope, not because we forget the pain, but because we believe the connection is still worth it. That's what makes the paradox so strong. We know what love can do, we've seen the damage, but we still reach for it, not out of ignorance, but out of need. The need to feel known, the need to belong, the need to say, here I am, and have someone answer, I see you. Love is a wager. Every time you offer your heart and say, I trust you not to drop this. And maybe they don't, maybe they protect it, nurture it, help it grow, or maybe they drop it without meaning to, or hand it back without warning, or disappear while holding it. The result is the same. You're left carrying the equation, trying to solve for X when the variables keep changing. Some people stop trying, they numb out, stay casual, avoid depth, but avoidance doesn't erase the need, it just buries it, and buried needs don't die, they mutate into resentment, loneliness, detachment. The cost of avoiding pain is often a life without meaning, and that's its own kind of suffering, so what do? We love anyway. Because the alternative is worse, we accept the paradox. We stop expecting love to be safe. We stop demanding guarantees. We learn to navigate the risk, knowing that pain doesn't always mean failure, sometimes it just means depth, but the question remains. If the ones who love you the most can also hurt you the deepest, how do you ever feel safe again? The comfort zone decay begins with a subtle trap. You find a routine that feels manageable, a set of habits, places, people, thoughts, all familiar, all predictable. Nothing hurts here, nothing surprises you, days look similar. Emotions stay quiet, you call it peace or stability or maybe just normal life. But slowly, almost invisibly, something else happens. The edges of who you are begin to fade. You stop exploring, stop questioning, stop risking. You stay within what's known and begin to forget what growth felt like. That's the paradox. The comfort zone feels safe, but it's slowly killing parts of you, not physically, not obviously, but internally where it matters. Growth is uncomfortable, change is difficult, so we stay still and start to decay. You don't notice it at first, you're just taking time for yourself. You're not in the mood, you're waiting for the right moment. But the moment never comes, because comfort, once it sets in, rewrites your sense of urgency. It tells you that tomorrow is always an option, and that's how you lose years. Imagine someone who wanted to be a writer. They loved stories, had ideas, even wrote a few chapters, but they got busy, life happened, rent had to be paid, and slowly the dream moved from soon to maybe to never. Not because they gave up, but because they got comfortable. A steady job, a quiet home, streaming services, food delivery, no crisis, no push, just a life that didn't demand anything more than maintenance. And in that maintenance, the version of themselves that wanted more began to disappear. This isn't laziness, it's inertia. Once you stop moving, it gets harder to start again. The same brain that once chased challenge now tells you it's not worth the effort. You begin to confuse rest with stagnation, safety with numbness. And because nothing is obviously wrong, you assume nothing is wrong. But the decay isn't loud, it's quiet. You forget what it feels like to be excited. You stop missing the parts of you that used to feel alive. This is where the paradox becomes dangerous. Because comfort isn't evil, it's necessary. Everyone needs recovery, everyone needs safety. The problem is when comfort becomes the default, when you build your entire identity around avoiding difficulty. That's when decay sets in, not the kind you can see. The kind you only notice when it's already done its damage. You wake up one day and realize you haven't felt proud of yourself in months, or inspired, or deeply connected to anything real. And yet you're fine. You have food, a place to sleep, a routine, you're functional, you're polite, you smile at the right times. But internally you feel like you've paused, like something once sharp has gone soft. You don't chase things anymore. You don't create or risk or speak up. You tell yourself you're content, but really you're afraid that trying again might break you, that failing again might hurt too much. So you settle, you shrink, you stay still. Comfort seduces you by offering protection, but it demands a trade, growth. It tells you you can have peace, but you must give up momentum. And over time, that momentum becomes harder to reclaim. You forget how to stretch yourself, how to handle fear, how to tolerate failure, because you've insulated yourself from all of it. And that insulation, while soothing, also isolates you from your own potential. You see this everywhere: talented people who stop practicing, curious people who stop asking questions, brave people who become cautious, not because they failed, but because they succeeded just enough to feel secure. And once they felt secure, they stopped moving. That's the decay, not dramatic collapse, just the slow erosion of ambition. Psychologists call this learned helplessness, sometimes disguised as contentment. You stop trying because the system around you rewards stillness. You meet expectations, you stay agreeable, you get approval, and all of it feels good for a while, until it doesn't, until the approval starts to feel hollow, until the routine starts to feel claustrophobic, until the dreams you postponed become regrets you carry in silence. This is the hidden danger of modern life. We're surrounded by systems designed to keep us comfortable. Instant entertainment, quick food, predictable feedback, safe opinions. And while these aren't inherently bad, they create an ecosystem that discourages discomfort. And without discomfort, there's no adaptation, no challenge, no reason to evolve. Think about language, muscles, relationships. All of them require tension to grow. You stretch a muscle, it tears slightly, it heals stronger. You argue with someone honestly, you understand them more deeply. You stumble over a new language and your brain rewires to hold it. Growth is mechanical and it requires resistance. Take away resistance and everything atrophies. The comfort zone removes resistance. That's why it feels good, and that's why it slowly dismantles you. It's not about living in chaos, it's about avoiding permanence. The comfort zone turns temporary rest into a permanent state, and once it's permanent, it stops being recovery and starts being avoidance. Avoidance of failure, of rejection, of judgment, but also of creativity, of courage, of discovery. The same barriers that protect you from pain also keep you from joy. Eventually, the question isn't, am I happy, but am I awake? Are you still growing? Or are you preserving a version of yourself that no longer wants anything? Some people try to escape this by chasing novelty. They travel, quit jobs, break routines, but escape isn't the solution. Movement without intention still leads nowhere. The only way out of the comfort zone is to confront it, to admit that you've stopped, to ask yourself, honestly, when was the last time you did something that scared you a little? The decay doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with alarms, it comes with compromise. You lower your standards, you delay your goals, you silence your instincts, and the worst part, it feels reasonable. You tell yourself it's maturity, or patience, or realism, but deep down you know it's fear. And that fear is subtle. It's not panic, it's not dread, it's just the whisper that says, why bother? And if you listen to it long enough, it becomes your voice, your worldview, your default. That's why the comfort zone is so dangerous. It doesn't ask you to quit, it just asks you to slow down, to stay safe, to wait, and the waiting becomes who you are, so how do you stop the decay? You move even slightly, you take a step that feels unnecessary, you risk something small, you say yes to something uncertain, not because you're ready, but because staying ready is part of the trap. The comfort zone never feels like a prison until you try to leave. So the real question is, are you still resting, or have you already started rotting? The control paradox begins with a familiar feeling, the need to manage everything. Your schedule, your emotions, your relationships, your surroundings, all carefully organized, predicted, and contained. It feels like responsibility, like discipline, like strength, but over time that grip starts to tighten. You stop trusting uncertainty. You start fearing unpredictability, and what once looked like control starts to look more like fear in disguise. That's the paradox. The more you try to control everything around you, the less control you have over yourself. You become reactive, rigid, anxious. You micromanage outcomes, and in doing so, you lose adaptability. You stop responding to reality and begin trying to force it to behave. The tighter you hold the reins, the more fragile everything becomes. One misstep, one unexpected variable, and the entire structure collapses. Not because the world failed you, but because your system didn't allow for change. Imagine someone who plans every hour of their day. They wake up at the same time, eat the same meals, talk to the same people, take comfort in routines. They're successful, organized, praised for their consistency. But underneath that structure is something else, fear. Fear that if they deviate, things will fall apart. That if they stop moving, they'll lose momentum. That if someone else takes control, they'll get hurt. So they keep managing, keep perfecting, keep tightening their grip. Then something happens, a breakup, a layoff, an illness, something they didn't plan for, and suddenly they realize they have no emotional tools to deal with it. Their systems don't work here, their logic doesn't apply. They panic not because the event is unbearable, but because they've forgotten how to adapt. Their control was external, their internal world was neglected. Now they're at the mercy of emotions they don't know how to handle. This is where the paradox reveals itself fully. Control gives the illusion of safety, but it doesn't make you safe. It makes you brittle. Flexible systems survive change. Rigid ones shatter. The person who insists on controlling everything might feel secure in the short term, but in the long run they lose resilience. They don't grow with their circumstances. They fight them, resist them, try to bend them into shapes that match their expectations, and when that fails, they break. It happens in relationships too. Someone tries to keep the peace by avoiding conflict, scripting every conversation, setting emotional rules for how their partner should behave. They think they're creating harmony, but they're really avoiding vulnerability. And the more they try to control the relationship, the more distant and mechanical it becomes. Because love doesn't thrive under control, it thrives under trust. And trust means accepting what you can't predict. The deeper truth is that control is often a trauma response. It comes from experiences where you felt helpless, dismissed, abandoned, or violated. So now you build systems, you organize, you plan, you anticipate, not because you're strong, but because you once felt powerless. And the only way to feel safe again is to manage everything. But safety built on control is never real. It's temporary, it's exhausting, and eventually it fails. That's when the anxiety starts, not the sharp panic, the quiet dread. The sense that something could go wrong at any moment, that you have to be ready. That rest is a luxury you can't afford. You stop sleeping well, you check things twice, you replay conversations, you analyze texts, and every time you do, you feel a little less free, because control isn't freedom, it's fear pretending to be discipline. This is the paradox most people live without knowing. They think they're being strong by keeping everything in check, but real strength is different. Real strength is flexibility. It's knowing that chaos will come and that you'll be okay anyway. It's learning to sit with discomfort instead of eliminating it. It's letting go of the outcome so you can engage fully with the process. There's a reason so many systems in nature operate through feedback, not force. Rivers adapt to terrain, trees bend with wind, animals change with seasons. Life is built on responsiveness. Only humans try to control everything, and we pay the price for it in stress, burnout, and emotional numbness, because control feels safe, but it's also a cage. You see this in careers. Someone tries to plan their entire trajectory, every move calculated, every decision optimized. But then they hit a dead end, or they change, or the world changes, and suddenly the plan doesn't fit. Now what? If their identity was tied to that plan, they don't just lose a path, they lose themselves. That's what control does. It trades adaptability for predictability, but the world doesn't stay predictable, so the control turns against you. Even internally, control can backfire. People try to control our emotions. Don't cry, don't feel that, don't be weak. But suppressed emotions don't disappear, they mutate into tension, into bitterness, into fatigue. You can't control your inner world with rules, you can only understand it with attention. This is why some people seem calm under pressure, not because they control more, but because they resist less. They don't fight reality, they adjust. They accept uncertainty not as failure, but as the cost of freedom. And because of that, they suffer less when things go wrong, not because they're lucky, but because they don't collapse when control disappears. They didn't build their identity around it. The control paradox isn't just about behavior, it's about identity. The more you believe I must manage everything, the more fragile you become when something escapes your grasp, and something always will. Plans break, people change, accidents happen. If your peace depends on the absence of unpredictability, you'll never feel peace, only temporary relief and constant scanning for threats. The solution isn't to abandon responsibility, it's to shift where control lives, not in the external world but in your internal response. You don't control the weather, you carry an umbrella. You don't control people, you set boundaries. You don't control outcomes, you commit to effort. That's the paradox. Real control only exists where you stop needing it to exist everywhere. And that requires trust, trust in yourself, trust in your adaptability, trust that even if things go wrong, you'll respond, not perfectly, not calmly, but meaningfully. That's where confidence comes from, not from certainty, but from the ability to navigate uncertainty. So next time you find yourself gripping tightly to a plan, to a person, to a story about how things must be, ask yourself, is this control keeping me safe, or is it keeping me small? The jealousy reflection begins with a glance, a moment, a shift in energy. You notice your partner smiling at someone else, or replying too quickly to a message, or talking about someone with too much interest. Nothing happens, not really. No rules are broken, no boundaries crossed, but something stirs inside you. A tightening in the chest, a suspicion, a need to know more. You tell yourself it's nothing, but the thought lingers, and that's where it starts. That's the paradox. Jealousy feels like a reaction to what someone else is doing, but it's actually a mirror for how you feel about yourself. You think you're worried about losing them, but you're really confronting the parts of you that already feel like you're not enough. The jealousy doesn't expose their betrayal, it exposes your insecurity. It's not about them, it's about what you believe you're lacking. Imagine a person in a relationship who sees their partner laughing at someone else's joke, not a stranger, but a friend or maybe an ex. Rationally, they know it's harmless. Emotionally, it hits like a wave. Questions flood in. Is that how they used to laugh with them? Do I make them feel like that? Are they comparing me? The jealousy builds, not because anything is wrong, but because something inside them is unresolved. And that unresolved part turns ordinary moments into emotional threats. This is how jealousy operates. It masquerades as protection. I care, I'm alert, I'm guarding what's mine. But beneath the surface, it's not about protecting the relationship. It's about protecting the self, the part of you that feels replaceable, the part that fears you're not the best option, the part that's waiting to be abandoned or outperformed or left behind. That's where the paradox deepens. Jealousy is a feeling about someone else that tells you more about you. It's like looking into a distorted mirror. You see them as dangerous, but what you're really seeing is your own fragility. You try to control their behavior when what you really need is to confront your own fear. And that fear isn't always irrational. Often it comes from past experiences, betrayals, rejections, comparisons that made you feel small. So now every potential threat triggers that same wound. You're not just reacting to the moment, you're reacting to the memory of moments like it. Jealousy becomes a reflex, a defense mechanism. But it doesn't defend the relationship, it defends the ego, and often it damages the very connection it's trying to protect. You see this when someone starts monitoring their partner's behavior, checking phones, asking leading questions, making accusations, not because they have evidence but because they have fear. And that fear, unexamined, becomes a weapon, not against the partner, against the trust, against the space where love is supposed to breathe, because love needs freedom, and jealousy constricts. Psychologically, jealousy is linked to self-image. The more confident someone feels in their worth, the less they fear competition, not because they believe they're better, but because they no longer see others as threats. They recognize their own value, and when you value yourself, someone else's beauty, success, or charm doesn't feel like an attack. It just exists. It doesn't diminish you. But when you don't trust your own worth, everything becomes a comparison. Their coworker is more interesting. Their ex was more attractive. That stranger was more confident. And each comparison confirms the fear, I'm not enough. That's the voice behind jealousy. Not rage, not control, just fear of being forgotten. The paradox is that jealousy pretends to be about protecting love, but often it erodes it. It creates distance, mistrust. It turns partners into suspects and conversations into interrogations. It makes people feel like they're walking on eggshells. And in that atmosphere, intimacy dies, because intimacy needs safety, not the safety of rules and boundaries, but the safety of being trusted, of being believed. People try to fix jealousy by controlling the external world, banning contact with certain people, setting rigid rules, demanding constant reassurance. But none of that solves the problem, because the problem isn't out there, it's inside. Unless you face the insecurity, no amount of control will bring peace. You'll always find a new threat, a new reason to feel anxious, a new excuse to blame them for your fear. This is the core of the reflection. Jealousy doesn't show you their behavior, it shows you your wound. It shows you where you still doubt yourself, where you still need healing. It says, look here, this is where you don't believe you're lovable enough to be chosen freely. And that belief shapes everything. It shapes how you interpret their tone, their delays, their compliments, their friendships, even their silence. You start to read between lines that were never written. You start to suspect motives where none exist, because your mind is scanning for proof, not of their betrayal, but of your fear. And when you find it, when something feels off or ambiguous or unexplained, the jealousy floods in, not because something happened, but because something was triggered. A pattern, a story, a memory, and now you're not even reacting to your partner anymore. You're reacting to your past projected onto them. This is why jealousy doesn't always go away with love. You can love someone deeply and still feel jealous, because love doesn't automatically heal insecurity. That work has to be done separately. You can't fix jealousy by receiving more affection. You fix it by believing you're worthy of that affection in the first place. And sometimes that belief has to be rebuilt from the ground up. You have to examine where the wound began, who taught you that love is conditional, that affection is a competition, that people leave when someone better appears. And once you find the source, you have to decide, is that belief still serving you, or is it keeping you trapped? The reflection shows you the answer. Every time jealousy appears, it invites you to look inward, not to ignore red flags. Real betrayal exists, but to distinguish between danger and projection, between facts and fears, between what's happening and what you're afraid is happening. Because the truth is, even if someone is loyal, jealousy can still destroy the relationship. Not because they hurt you, but because your fear convinced you they would. That's the final twist of the paradox. Jealousy can become the very thing that creates the loss it's trying to prevent. So the question is not, is my partner doing something wrong? The real question is, when jealousy shows up, what part of me still believes I could be replaced? The memory rewriting paradox begins with a simple realization. You remember something as beautiful, but you know you weren't happy at the time. It might be a relationship, a childhood home, a certain year of your life, and when you think back on it, it feels warm, maybe even perfect. But if you stop and really examine it, you remember the anxiety, the tension, the loneliness, and yet the memory stays golden. Why? That's the paradox. Memory doesn't just record your past, it edits it. It rewrites. It smooths edges, adds color, deletes discomfort. You think you're recalling what happened, but you're really recalling what you believe happened. And what you believe is shaped not just by facts, but by emotions, regrets, and narratives formed later. So the memory you trust is often a version of the past that never truly existed. Imagine someone looking at an old photo, them and a former partner on vacation, smiling, glowing, carefree. They feel a wave of nostalgia, maybe even longing. But if they had journaled that day, it might have read, "We argued in the car, I felt disconnected, I couldn't sleep last night." The image doesn't lie, but it doesn't tell the full truth either. It becomes an icon of happiness, even though the happiness was incomplete or entirely absent. This is the mechanism of memory rewriting. The mind compresses complex experiences into manageable narratives. It can't store every emotion, every contradiction, so it prioritizes. Sometimes it highlights what hurt. Other times it preserves only what soothed. And the danger is you start to believe those curated memories as if they were objective, as if that moment, that time, that person was exactly as you now remember. But memory is not a recording, it's a reconstruction. And every time you recall something, you slightly alter it. Current emotions seep in, present beliefs color the past. If you're lonely now, you might remember past companionship as more fulfilling than it was. If you feel content now, you might downplay how hard things were before. Either way, the memory becomes less about the past and more about the present, using the past to tell a story. This is where it becomes dangerous. You start idealizing things that were never good for you. A toxic relationship becomes passionate. A controlling parent becomes strict but loving. A period of burnout becomes the most productive time of my life. You begin chasing ghosts, wanting to go back to places that didn't nurture you, missing people who didn't treat you well. And the paradox is, you know this. You remember the bad, but the edited version feels better, so you believe it. And it's not just personal. Societies do this too. Nations remember golden ages that were actually filled with injustice. Families remember holidays that were filled with tension. Cultural nostalgia gets weaponized. People long for times that never existed, and they make decisions, political, emotional, relational, based on a rewritten past. That's the collective version of the paradox. We act on memories we've polished until they shine too brightly to question. Psychologists call this rosy retrospection. It's not denial, it's selective attention. You focus on the parts of the memory that affirm a comforting narrative, and that narrative becomes a map for identity, for desire, for regret. But if the map is inaccurate, you get lost. You try to recreate a feeling that wasn't even real when it first happened. You want a version of the past that only exists in your mind. This is especially true in relationships. Someone leaves, you miss them. But what exactly do you miss? The connection or the fantasy of how it used to feel? You scroll through old messages, remember the way they held you, the inside jokes. But you forget how often you felt unseen, how often you doubted, how much you changed who you were to keep them close. And yet the edited memory calls to you like a lighthouse guiding you back into the storm. The paradox here is that the memory isn't fake, it's just partial, incomplete, framed. You didn't invent the good moments, but you might have exaggerated them. And you didn't forget the bad, you just pushed it out of focus. That's how memory protects you, but it also deceives you. Because when you act on rewritten memories, you make real decisions, going back, reaching out, regretting your growth, all based on illusions. There's another layer. Sometimes the opposite happens. You remember something as terrible and later realize it was. Trauma can amplify the negative, or shame can erase the good. You might remember a conversation as humiliating when really no one else noticed. You might remember yourself as weak when in reality you showed resilience. This too is rewriting, only in reverse. Not romanticizing, but demonizing. Not longing for the past, but running from it. So either way, memory plays tricks, and those tricks shape who you think you are, because identity is built on memory. Your story of yourself is a timeline of remembered events. If those memories are distorted, then your sense of self might be too. You might carry guilt for something that never happened the way you think it did. You might miss someone you never truly had. You might long for a life that never existed. And when you try to explain this to someone, to say, "I know it felt good then, but I also remember being deeply unhappy," they might not understand, because it doesn't feel like a contradiction. It feels like a mystery. How could something that hurt so much now feel like something you want again? That's the rewriting, not malicious, just structural. Your mind trying to make sense of complexity by simplifying it, by smoothing it, but in doing so, it risks misleading you. And this leads to a final danger. When the present doesn't feel as good as the past, you assume the problem is now. You think, I was happier then, I should go back to that job, that person, that place. But what if the memory of happiness is inflated? What if your mind, desperate for certainty, made the past feel better than it was? Then your longing isn't a call to return, it's a symptom of forgetting. So the paradox remains, you remember something as perfect, but you also remember being miserable inside it. Which version is real? And if you can't trust your memories, how do you know what you truly want now? The comparison poison begins quietly. You open your phone, scroll through a feed, see someone laughing at a party you weren't invited to, someone younger buying a house, someone older starting over, someone who looks happier, stronger, more loved. You weren't thinking about your life before this moment, but now you are, and something that felt fine 5 minutes ago suddenly feels inadequate. That's the paradox. You know that comparing yourself to others makes you feel worse. You know it's irrational. You know people only show the best parts. You know the context is missing. And still you do it, daily, involuntarily, even painfully. You compare and compare even when the comparison has no meaning. You know it's poison and you keep drinking. Imagine someone who wakes up on a Monday feeling okay. Their plans are modest. A to-do list, a workout, maybe time with a friend. They feel grounded. But then they open their phone. A peer has launched a new business. Another just announced a vacation. Another posts a photo with a partner smiling in soft sunlight. And now nothing on the list feels good enough. The joy is gone, not because anything changed, but because someone else's highlight rewrote the emotional script of the day. This is the mechanism of comparison. It doesn't assess worth. It distorts perception. You don't feel less because you are less. You feel less because someone else is more in that moment, in that frame, in that carefully curated image. Your brain doesn't ask, is this person happy? It asks, are they doing better than me? And if the answer feels like yes, the poison spreads. But the poison isn't in their success. It's in your interpretation, your belief that your value drops when theirs rises. That success is a limited resource. That someone else's joy means there's less left for you. This is the scarcity loop, and it drives the comparison paradox. You know your path is different. You know your timing is your own. But emotionally, you still feel like you're falling behind. And the danger is this isn't just envy, it's identity erosion. When you compare, you begin to see yourself through someone else's frame. You no longer ask, what do I want? You ask, what should I want to catch up? Your goals shift. Your desires mutate. You start chasing things not because they fulfill you, but because someone else made them look desirable. And in the process, you lose the thread of your own story. This isn't new, it predates social media. It shows up in families, schools, communities. One sibling becomes the smart one, so the other becomes the funny one. One student gets praise, the other starts trying harder or gives up. We define ourselves against others long before we understand who we are on our own. Comparison is built into the social fabric, but today it's amplified, accelerated, constant. You can now compare your entire life to thousands of others before breakfast, and every one of those comparisons is incomplete. You see a photo, not the fight they had that morning, a career win, not the burnout that preceded it, a beautiful body, not the disorder that shaped it. You see results, not processes, outcomes, not costs, and your mind, wired for fairness and status, fills in the blanks with assumptions, dangerous ones. And then the deeper paradox kicks in. Even if you reach the thing you once envied, the body, the job, the lifestyle, the feeling doesn't go away. You just find new people to compare to, new levels, new illusions, because the root isn't what others have. It's the belief that your value is conditional, that you are only enough if you are better than, taller than, richer than, more admired than, but comparison has no finish line, only shifting targets. So you keep going, climbing a ladder that stretches infinitely upward, surrounded by people who seem a few rungs ahead. You don't realize they're doing the same, looking at others, feeling behind, questioning their worth. Everyone's looking sideways. No one feels arrived. And that's the final cruelty. You might be someone else's object of envy. You might be the version they wish they were, but it doesn't help. Because when you're caught in the comparison loop, you can't absorb admiration. You only see the gaps, the lacks, the almosts. This impacts everything. Your relationships because you compare your partner to someone else's. Your career because you measure success by other timelines. Your creativity, because someone is always better, faster, more recognized. Even your rest, because someone is being productive while you're not, so you never feel finished. You never feel allowed, you never feel free. The solution isn't pretending you don't notice others. That's impossible. We're social creatures. We mirror, we map, but awareness is not the same as absorption. You can notice someone's beauty without doubting your own. You can admire someone's talent without questioning your path, but only if you connect worth from comparison. Only if you build your identity on internal alignment, not external ranking. That's the shift from am I better than them to am I in sync with myself, from how do I look from the outside to how do I feel on the inside. But that shift requires unlearning, and unlearning hurts because comparison feels like truth, it feels like reality, but it's not, it's a distortion. A poisoned mirror that always makes you look smaller than you are. And the more you chase validation through comparison, the more empty you feel when you get it. Because what you're chasing isn't achievement, it's relief. Relief from doubt, from inadequacy. But relief doesn't come from being better than someone. It comes from being okay with being yourself. So the paradox holds, you know comparison is poison, you drink it anyway. So the question becomes, how many versions of yourself will you abandon just to keep measuring up? The Trust Fragility Paradox begins with a slow, invisible process. You meet someone and over time, piece by piece, you give them access. Access to your thoughts, your emotions, your fears. You share things you don't say out loud. You allow them to see you unfiltered. And with every shared truth, trust is built slowly, delicately, like stacking glass. You don't think about it much. It feels natural, mutual, stable. But then something happens. A lie, a withdrawal, a broken promise, maybe big, maybe small, but something shifts. And suddenly the entire structure feels unsafe. Everything that took years to build now feels exposed, unstable, ruined. You tell yourself not to overreact, but the feeling is already there. Something has cracked, and you're not sure if it can be repaired. That's the paradox. Trust takes years to build, seconds to break, and sometimes a lifetime to rebuild, but even then it's never the same. Once damaged, it becomes cautious, conditional, strained. The innocence of belief is gone. What remains is an ongoing negotiation with risk. You want to trust again, but now you can't unsee what happened. And it doesn't matter how strong you are. Trust isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of hope. It means you allowed yourself to believe that someone would treat your vulnerability with care. And when that hope is broken, it's not just about them, it's about you, your judgment, your openness, your ability to protect yourself. When trust fails, you question not only the relationship, but your own sense of reality. This is why betrayal, even small, feels so devastating. It doesn't just hurt, it rewrites the past. Suddenly, every kind word, every promise, every moment of closeness feels suspect. Were they lying then too? Did they mean it? Were you blind? The damage isn't just forward, it echoes backward, making memory feel untrustworthy. That's what makes the break so deep. And the paradox only grows, because now you want clarity. You want an explanation, something that makes it make sense. But often there isn't one. People change, people hide things, people protect themselves at your expense. And no matter how detailed the excuse, it doesn't erase the fact that they did something you didn't think they were capable of. And now you have to live with that version of them, the version you didn't see until it was too late. You try to forgive, maybe you succeed, maybe you pretend, but forgiveness isn't the same as trust. Forgiveness is about release, trust is about belief. And belief, once broken, doesn't rebuild by willpower alone. It needs evidence, time, consistency. Even then, it remains altered. You don't forget the fracture. You just learn how to live around it. Sometimes you don't rebuild at all, you walk away, but the wound follows. In the next relationship, you hesitate, you overanalyze, you prepare for betrayal before it happens. You guard your heart, not because the new person did anything wrong, but because the last one changed how you perceive risk. This is the long shadow of broken trust. It punishes the future for what the past did. And you know this isn't fair. You don't want to be paranoid. You want to love freely again, but something inside holds back. A voice that says, don't be naive. A memory that says, remember what happened last time. And now you're torn between wanting connection and fearing pain, between craving intimacy and dreading exposure. You become half present, cautiously attached, always braced for the next rupture. This is the fragility. Trust is strong until it's not. It feels like a fortress until the door is left unlocked once. Then everything changes. And what's worse, the person who broke it might not even understand the damage. They might apologize, minimize, explain, but trust isn't logic, it's emotion, it's felt safety. And once that feeling is gone, it doesn't return on command. This shows up in all kinds of relationships: romantic, familial, professional. A friend shares something you told them in confidence. A partner lies to avoid conflict. A parent fails to show up when it mattered. The offense might be forgivable, but the message it sends is irreversible. You can't fully rely on me. And once that idea enters your mind, it stays, quietly, waiting. Even in yourself, trust can break. You say, "I'll never go back to them." Then you do, you promise, "I'll speak up next time." Then you stay silent. And each time you betray your own boundaries, your self-trust weakens. You stop believing your own promises, and that erosion is subtle but profound. Because if you can't trust yourself, how do you navigate anyone else? Some people respond by becoming stricter. More rules, more boundaries, more control. But control doesn't rebuild trust, it replaces it. It says, "I don't trust you, so I'll manage you." But managing someone isn't connection, it's fear in disguise. And fear can't sustain closeness. It only delays the next break. Others respond by becoming passive. They stop expecting much, accept less, keep everyone at arm's length. But distance doesn't protect you, it just starves you. You stop getting hurt, but you also stop getting loved. So what's left? The paradox doesn't resolve. Trust will always be fragile. And yet it's the foundation of every meaningful bond. You need it, but you can't force it. You can only offer it cautiously and hope it's returned. But even then, one question remains: if trust can shatter in a second, how do you ever feel safe again? The emotional lag paradox begins with delay. Something happens, an argument, a goodbye, a disappointment, and at first you feel nothing. You go through the motions, you explain what happened, you talk about it rationally. You move on, or at least it looks like you have. But hours later, or days, or weeks, the emotion catches up. Suddenly a wave hits: grief, anger, longing, confusion. You find yourself crying without knowing why, or angry when nothing new has happened. And you realize your body and your mind weren't on the same timeline. That's the paradox. You don't always feel things when they happen. You feel them after, long after. Sometimes too late to process them properly. Too late to respond, too late to even explain. The event is over. Everyone else has moved on. But you're just beginning to experience what it meant. Emotion arrives like a message in a bottle, delayed, cryptic, sometimes unwanted, and yet undeniably real. Imagine someone ending a relationship. They stay calm during the conversation. They say all the right things. "I understand. It's okay. I wish you well." They go home, clean their room, even sleep peacefully that night. But 2 days later, they can't get out of bed. Music sounds different. Food has no taste. They start rereading old messages, feeling every word like a knife. The break didn't hurt when it happened. It hurts now, because the body needed time, the mind needed silence. The soul needed space to understand what was lost. This is emotional lag, and it's more common than we admit. We live in a world that rewards quick reactions, instant responses, immediate feelings, but emotions don't always work that way. Some are slow, some are shy, some need safety before they appear. Others wait until you stop moving, until you're quiet enough to notice them. And this delay creates problems. People around you don't understand. "Why are you upset now? That was weeks ago. I thought you were fine." So you begin to doubt your own reaction. You feel like a fraud, like you're being dramatic, like you're manufacturing emotion to match a moment that already passed. But you're not. You're just late, not in truth, but in timing. And that delay can be dangerous, because it means you don't always set boundaries when you need to. You don't always stand up for yourself in the moment. You say, "It's fine," when it's not. You nod when you should speak. You stay when you should leave. And later, when the emotion hits, it's too late to fix the scene. The moment is gone. The damage is done. All you can do is sit with the failing and wonder why it came now instead of then. This creates a sense of disconnection between your life and your experience of it. You don't trust your own reactions. You start to see yourself as emotionally unpredictable, even though what's happening is perfectly logical. Emotion isn't always immediate. Sometimes it's delayed because your mind was in survival mode. Sometimes it's delayed because the truth was too big to absorb all at once. Sometimes it's delayed because you were too focused on others to notice yourself. And the world rarely makes space for this. Work doesn't pause for delayed grief. Friends don't always have patience for feelings that arrive after the fact, so you learn to compress, to hide, to file emotions under too late to matter. But they don't go away. They live in the body, in the jaw you clench for no reason, in the headaches, in the fatigue, in the dreams that replay something you said didn't bother you. This is the cost of emotional lag. You carry pain without context. You grieve silently. You get overwhelmed by feelings that no one else can see, and you can't always explain why you're sad on a good day or anxious after things are finally calm. You just are because your timeline is your own, and your nervous system doesn't care about social expectations. The paradox deepens when the delay is long. Months, years, a parent dies and you don't cry until your child graduates. A breakup happens and the real sadness hits after you fall for someone new. A childhood wound surfaces in the middle of a work project. You wonder why now, but there's no why, there's just readiness. The emotion wasn't safe to feel then, it is now, and so it arrives. Some try to fix this by forcing feelings. Let it out, they say, process it. But emotion doesn't respond to commands, it doesn't work on schedule, it arrives when it has the room to be felt. And if you've spent years avoiding that room, staying busy, staying strong, staying distracted, then yes, it might take a while. And yet we blame ourselves for not crying at the funeral, for not getting angry during the betrayal, for not feeling grateful in the moment of success. But delayed emotion is not a failure, it's a function of being human. It's a reminder that feeling is not always simultaneous with experience, that knowing and processing are different. That time doesn't just as forward, it loops, echoes, returns. You feel something today that was planted last year. You mourn something this week that happened a decade ago. You smile now at a memory that once hurt. Emotion travels through time, not always in order. And that disorder is okay, but it's disorienting because the world asks, why now? And you ask yourself the same thing. But maybe the better question is what feelings are still waiting for their time to arrive. The silence after pain paradox begins not with the scream, but with what follows. After the fight, after the betrayal, after the collapse, there is quiet, not peace, not relief, just a hollow space where emotion used to live. You expect to cry, to rage, to feel something, but instead there's nothing, numbness, stillness, a blankness that feels more alarming than the pain itself. That's the paradox. You think the worst part of suffering is the pain, but often it's what comes after the emotional silence. The period when you can't feel anything, even though you know you should. When people ask if you're okay and you say, I'm fine, not out of politeness, but because there's genuinely nothing to report. No language, no sensation, just a fog. That's when you realize something inside you went quiet and you're not sure how to turn it back on. Imagine someone who goes through a breakup that shatters their sense of identity. In the moment they cry, shake, reach out, but then nothing, the texts stop, the phone doesn't ring, the apartment is quiet. And suddenly so are they, no more sobbing, no more talking, no more music, days pass in a flat rhythm. Meals are skipped, conversations are shallow, they aren't healing, they're paused, frozen, not because they want to be, but because their system shut down to survive. This is the silence after pain, a state where the nervous system, overwhelmed by emotion, stops sending signals. The mind goes blank, the body goes into standby, the heart closes its doors, you function sometimes even impressively. You go to work, you reply to emails, you say the right things, but you're not present, you're operating on pre-written scripts. There is no spontaneity, no laughter that reaches the chest, no sadness that reaches the eyes, just routine, just existence. And this silence is often misunderstood. Others see it as strength, you're handling it so well, you're so composed, but they don't realize that what looks like control is actually absence, that you're not calm, you're vacant, and the longer it lasts, the harder it is to remember what real emotion felt like. You miss crying, you miss anger, even grief feels preferable to the nothingness. Because at least grief is movement, silence is stagnation. This is where the paradox deepens. The brain uses silence to protect you. When the emotional system is overloaded, it shuts down to prevent further damage, like a circuit breaker, like a power outage during a storm. But unlike a storm, there's no obvious sign when the silence should end. No one flips the switch, you just wait, wondering if this is your new normal. And that waiting is dangerous because emotional silence can become a lifestyle. You stop expecting to feel deeply again, you lower the volume on life, you stop taking risks, you say no to things that might stir something. Joy, yes, but also fear, also vulnerability. You live in grayscale, not because you prefer it, but because it's safe. And then the world starts to feel distant. People around you laugh, cry, fall in love, fall apart, and you watch from behind a screen. Not jealous, not disconnected, just not involved. You don't feel excluded, you feel separate. Like emotion is something that happens to other people now. You used to be one of them. Now you observe, you perform, you endure. Some try to break the silence with distraction. Noise, work, parties, new relationships, but the silence isn't loud, it absorbs sound. You can stand in the middle of a crowded room and still feel nothing. Because silence after pain isn't about the outside, it's about a shut door inside the self. And until that door opens again, the room remains empty. Others try to wait it out. Give it time, they say, and sometimes that works. Slowly, sensation returns, a song hits different, a memory surfaces, a tear finally falls, and with it the silence cracks. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the silence settles in like dust. Days turn to months, months to years, and you forget that anything was ever different. That's when people start saying you've changed, that you're colder, more logical, less reactive, and you agree you have changed, but not by choice. The pain didn't make you stronger, it made you quieter, less available, less willing to hope, because hope is what made the pain possible, and now your system avoids anything that looks like hope, just in case. The paradox is that the silence feels safe, but it's slowly erasing you, not all at once, not dramatically, just bit by bit. You lose enthusiasm, you stop dreaming, you forget how to imagine new outcomes. You become someone who waits for things to pass, not someone who reaches for what matters. And people start to miss you, not physically, you're still around, but the version of you that laughed loudly or cried openly or spoke with conviction, that version is quiet now, and no one knows how to bring it back, not even you. You try, you journal, you med. You talk to someone, but the words feel distant, like you're describing someone else's life, someone else's heartbreak, and when the therapist asks, "How did that make you feel?" you don't know how to answer, because there's no feeling to report, just silence, just the echo of what used to be there. And that's the cruelest part. You remember who you were before the silence, but you can't reach them anymore. So the question is, what do you do when even pain goes quiet and you're still not okay? The self-worth illusion paradox begins with a moment of approval. Someone compliments you, chooses you, admires you. You feel seen, valued, alive. For a while the feeling lasts. You walk taller, you speak with more ease. You feel worthy, but then the approval fades. The person pulls away, the attention stops, and suddenly your sense of value disappears with it. You don't just feel rejected, you feel erased. Like you only existed because someone else decided you did. That's the paradox. You want to believe your worth is internal, that it comes from self-knowledge, from character, from integrity, but your emotions say otherwise, because your mood rises and falls with how others respond to you. Their desire feels like proof that you matter. Their silence feels like evidence that you don't. And even when you know this isn't healthy, you keep doing it. You keep outsourcing your value. Imagine someone who feels invisible most of the time. They work hard, stay quiet, follow rules. Then one day someone notices, a mentor praises them, a partner desires them. A stranger compliments them in a way that feels sincere, and in that moment something lights up. They feel important, whole, validated, but they don't realize what just happened. They tied their self-worth to an external signal, and that signal is unstable. Because people change, attention fades, attraction shifts, and when it does, they're left chasing that original feeling, not because they want the person, but because they want the version of themselves they became in that person's eyes. That's the illusion. You think you miss them, but really, you miss feeling valuable. And so you try to replicate it. You post something and check who likes it. You say something clever and watch who laughs. You wear something new and scan for reactions. And every time you get approval, it feels good. But it also deepens the dependency. Because now, silence doesn't feel neutral. It feels like a verdict, a judgment, a confirmation that you're no longer enough. This is how the illusion builds, slowly, quietly. You don't wake up one day and decide, my self-worth depends on others. You just start noticing how much better you feel when you're wanted, how much safer life seems when you're admired, how much easier it is to like yourself when someone else likes you first. And the paradox grows, because even when you know it's an illusion, you still crave it. You still measure your day by the attention you did or didn't receive. And worst of all, when someone treats you poorly, you wonder what's wrong with you, not them. You internalize the disrespect. You turn rejection into self-blame. Because somewhere along the line, you learn that being loved is proof of being good. But what happens when no one is looking? What happens on the days when no one calls, no one compliments, no one chooses you? That's when the illusion reveals its cost. You feel hollow, not because you are, but because you built your reflection using mirrors you don't control. And this isn't just about romance, it happens at work. You feel valuable when you're praised, disposable when you're ignored. It happens in families. You feel like a failure if you don't live up to expectations. It happens with friends. You feel insecure if you're left out. And in all these cases, your sense of worth is shaped not by who you are, but by how others perceive you, or worse, how you think they perceive you. That last part is important. Often, it's not even their opinion, it's your assumption of it. They might not be judging you, they might just be busy. But if you're tied to external validation, any absence feels like rejection. You create stories, they don't care, I'm not impressive, they found someone better. And these stories feel real because the emotional system doesn't need facts, it just needs patterns. And the pattern says, you're only okay when someone else says so. Because even when someone does choose you, the relief is temporary. You feel worthy, yes, but also terrified, because now you have something to lose. Now their affection is the only thing standing between you and emotional collapse. So you perform, you adapt, you become what they want, not to manipulate, but to survive. Because losing them would mean losing the feeling of being enough. And over time, that performance becomes exhausting. You forget what you actually want. You make choices based on how they'll be perceived. You say yes when you mean no. You stay silent when something hurts, because the fear of disapproval is stronger than your desire for authenticity. That's the illusion's final cost. You're not just dependent on others to feel worthy. You're afraid to be yourself in case that worth gets taken away. And sometimes it does. You show the real you and they walk or criticize or ghost, and it confirms the belief, I shouldn't have shown that part wasn't lovable. But maybe the truth is the opposite, they didn't leave because you were unworthy. Maybe they left because they couldn't handle honesty. Maybe the problem is that your worth is missing, it's that you keep trying to prove it, so what's the alternative? You build from the inside slowly, quietly, without applause. You do things that align with your values. You make promises to yourself and keep them. You notice your own effort. You sit with loneliness and learn that it doesn't kill you. You practice being okay without a spotlight. And over time, something strange happens. You start to feel solid, even when no one's watching, even when no one's clapping. But the paradox never fully goes away. You'll always feel the pull because being seen is addictive. But the real question is, who are you when no one is looking, and does that version still feel like enough? The growth loneliness paradox begins the moment you choose to stop being who you were, not in a dramatic act of rebellion or reinvention, but in quiet, often invisible decisions that slowly move you away from the version of yourself that others learned to depend on, the version that tolerated what hurt, that performed what was expected, that stayed predictable in order to be accepted. And it doesn't happen with a single moment of clarity or some grand awakening, but through a slow accumulation of discomforts, realizations, disappointments, and patterns you can no longer ignore. Patterns that used to seem normal, tolerable, even necessary for belonging, but now feel suffocating, artificial, or worse, unrecognizable. And when this shift begins, when you start to unlearn the behaviors that kept you small, silent, agreeable, or distracted, something else begins to fade as well. Your connection to the people, environments, and conversations that were built around your former self, not because they were fake or malicious or shallow, but because they were forged in a context that no longer fits, a language you no longer speak fluently, a rhythm you can no longer follow without bending your integrity in ways that feel increasingly unbearable. That's the paradox. Growth is often imagined as a process of gaining, of becoming more, of finding new light and freedom and clarity. And in some ways that is true, but what most people don't tell you is that the first and most consistent symptom of real psychological, emotional, or spiritual growth is loneliness, not the clean, peaceful kind of solitude that we romanticize in self-help slogans, but the disorienting kind, the kind that makes you question whether you've made a mistake. Whether your standards are too high, whether your desire for more honesty, more depth, more alignment is actually just a disguise for fear, for ego, or for entitlement. Because what happens, inevitably, is that you begin to see, with painful clarity, just how much of your former life was built on versions of you that were less aware, less boundaried, less connected to your actual needs. And as that awareness grows, the dissonance grows with it, not because others have changed, but because you have, and the connections that once felt effortless now require effort that feels artificial, like you're acting in a role you no longer believe in. reciting lines that no longer match the shape of your mouth, nodding along with things you no longer agree with just to avoid the tension of standing out. And yet, the standing out happens anyway. Because people can feel when you've changed, even if they don't understand how or why, they feel it in the way you hesitate before saying yes, in the way you no longer laugh at the same jokes, in the way you don't respond immediately to the messages that used to trigger guilt in you. And that feeling, that subtle withdrawal of automatic participation, threatens something unspoken in the social fabric, especially in friendships, family systems, or long-standing groups that rely on predictability and emotional sameness to maintain closeness, so instead of celebration, your growth is met with distance. Not always directly, not always aggressively, but through delayed responses, through jokes that carry a sharper edge, through invitations that stop arriving, through conversations that once were long and open but now feel like tight scripts that avoid anything real. And slowly you start to feel like a stranger in the places that once felt like home, not because anyone said so, but because your very presence now introduces friction where there used to be flow, and in that friction, you start to feel guilty. Guilty for changing, guilty for seeing what you didn't see before, guilty for noticing the manipulation, the subtle put-downs, the emotional labor you used to provide for free, the constant appeasement you used to give without even recognizing it as appeasement, and now that you can't unsee it, now that your body responds with tension instead of compliance, now that your silence feels more honest than your forced participation, you begin to realize just how much of your social identity was built on a version of you that never had the space to say no without consequence. And when the consequence arrives in the form of distance, misunderstanding, or quiet exile, it doesn't feel like a punishment for being wrong, it feels like a punishment for waking up. And that's where the loneliness cuts the deepest. Because it's not just that you're alone, it's that you were told growth would be empowering, liberating, expansive, and yet what it's giving you is silence, uncertainty, long weekends without calls, group messages where your name no longer appears, celebrations you only find out about through photos posted later, and it makes you wonder, was this worth it? Was speaking up worth the rupture? Was leaving the toxic job, the controlling partner, the passive aggressive friend worth the echo that now fills the space they once occupied? Was setting the boundary worth the isolation? And the answer is yes, but not immediately. Because the truth is, the first phase of growth is dismantling, not of your life, but of your illusions, of the myths you carried about what love was supposed to feel like, about what loyalty was supposed to cost, about what strength was supposed to sound like. And in that dismantling, everything becomes less stable, less warm, less full, because the people and places that made you feel secure are now revealed to be conditional, transactional, or built on mutual avoidance. And so you float. You exist in the space between versions of yourself, no longer willing to play the old role, not yet anchored in the new one, no longer available for shallow conversations, not yet surrounded by people who can meet you in your depth, and that space, the in-between, can feel endless. Because new connections don't form instantly. People who align with your growth don't appear just because you decided to change. And even when they do, it takes time, sometimes a long time, to build intimacy that doesn't require performance, to build trust that doesn't require compromise, to build belonging that doesn't require shrinking. So in the meantime, you wait, you sit in the long nights where your phone stays quiet. You walk through the mornings where the usual noise is missing. You hear your own voice more than anyone else's. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to hear things in that silence, clarity, intuition, desires you didn't know you had, boundaries you didn't know you were allowed to set, needs you used to suppress just to keep others comfortable. And in that solitude, something new is built, not quickly, not painlessly, but authentically. You begin to learn how to enjoy your own company, not in the cliché sense of self-love, as spa days or affirmations, but in the sense of not needing to be understood in order to feel valid, not needing to be chosen in order to feel worthy, not needing to be constantly mirrored to know you exist. You begin to recognize that the loneliness was not a punishment, but a detox from roles, expectations, dynamics, and dependencies that had kept you from ever experiencing true emotional freedom. And when that realization settles, when the echo turns from painful to spacious, when you stop seeing the silence as abandonment and start seeing it as alignment, you finally understand what growth really costs. But in return, it gives you something far more durable: clarity, sovereignty, emotional truth, and the eventual magnetism that comes from no longer needing anything outside yourself to know who you are. But even with that wisdom, the paradox remains. Because even when you know that this loneliness is evidence of progress, even when you trust that new, deeper connections will come, even when you begin to love the space you've created inside yourself, the ache still exists. The ache for those who knew the old you. The ache for the simplicity of being liked, even if it meant being less honest. The ache for the feeling of being part of something, even if that something never truly saw you. And that ache doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. It means your growth didn't cost you your heart. It just changed where and with whom you're willing to place it. So the question is no longer, why am I alone now that I've grown? The real question is, are you willing to endure the ache of being misunderstood in exchange for finally being true? The time theft paradox begins in the unnoticed spaces between obligations, in the daily rituals you repeat without reflection, in the hours that pass without friction or intention, in the choices you never consciously made but continue to follow because they were handed to you by culture, by fear, by routine, or by exhaustion, and it doesn't feel like a crisis at first. It feels like life, like doing what you're supposed to, like staying responsible, staying safe, staying functional, until one quiet evening. Maybe after a long week of work, maybe after finishing a task you don't care about, maybe after scrolling on your phone for the third hour in a row, you suddenly stop, look around your apartment, your calendar, your memories, and feel something terrifying rise in your chest. The creeping awareness that an enormous amount of time has passed, and you weren't there for any of it. This is the paradox. Time feels like something you manage, something you plan, something you give or save or spend, but in truth, time is not yours to control, it's only yours to experience. And when that experience becomes passive, numb, or automatic, time continues to move forward without your participation, meaning that while your body was present and your tasks were completed, your inner life was elsewhere, distant, muted, detached, and now that you've resurfaced, you realize the theft wasn't loud. It wasn't violent, it wasn't even intentional, but it was total. And now you are left holding a stretch of years that feel thin, hollow, strangely absent of real meaning. You didn't lose time because something tragic happened, you lost it because nothing did, and that's what makes it so hard to explain to anyone else. Because from the outside, everything looked fine, you met deadlines, answered emails, paid bills, maintained relationships, kept routines. But inside, your days were dissolving into sameness, your weeks disappeared into obligations, and your mind became a corridor through which moments passed without leaving a trace, not because you were lazy or distracted or selfish, but because you were following a script that rewarded consistency over curiosity, efficiency over presence, and productivity over aliveness. And the more time you spend in this state, a state of gentle, socially accepted disengagement, the more your brain begins to normalize it, to convince you that this is just what adult life feels like, that everyone is tired, that everyone is overbooked, that everyone is just trying to make it through the week, and that wanting something more is naive, dramatic, or ungrateful, so you suppress the quiet restlessness that rises when you pause. You dismiss the subtle grief that lingers when you remember who you used to be, and you keep going, keep performing, keep completing tasks, even as the part of you that once felt wonder, once sought novelty, once chased something ineffable and personal, begins to shrink into a voice so small you only hear it in rare moments of silence. And when those moments come, late at night, early in the morning, or during some accidental encounter with beauty, like music or nature or a stranger's unexpected kindness, the voice doesn't shout, it simply asks, "What happened to you?" And the answer, if you're honest, is not simple because nothing specific happened, nothing traumatic, nothing cinematic, just time that passed without permission, time you surrendered to maintenance, to social obligations, to things that didn't excite you but felt safe, to people who didn't inspire you but felt familiar, to responsibilities that weren't truly yours but felt impossible to question. And now, as you sit in the aftermath, you feel not regret exactly, but distance. Distance from the person you meant to become, from the projects you meant to start, from the risks you meant to take before it felt too late. The theft wasn't orchestrated by a villain. There's no one to blame, not your boss, not your partner, not society, although all of those play a role because the real mechanism of the theft is internal. It's the quiet agreement you made to stop asking questions, to stop making changes, to stop disrupting what already feels settled, even if it doesn't feel right, and that agreement was never spoken aloud. It was made in tired moments, in small compromises. In the sigh you exhaled instead of saying no, in the delay you justified as just for now, in the vacation you postponed, in the conversation you avoided, in the risk you labeled unrealistic. And now, all those small avoidances have accumulated into something massive. A life that looks whole from the outside but feels partially abandoned from the inside. And the tragedy of this paradox is that the theft is often not noticed until it has already succeeded, because time doesn't return what it gave. It doesn't wait for you to realize you've been absent. It doesn't pause while you figure things out. It just moves forward, easily indifferently, carrying you with it. And if you're not actively choosing how to be present, how to align, how to engage, not just with tasks but with meaning, then the structure of your life will be filled with movement but empty of momentum, filled with noise but empty of melody, filled with events but empty of presence, and one day you'll look back and realize that the moments when you were most alive were also the moments when you were most uncertain, most afraid, most outside of the plan. And yet we keep choosing the plan, the job we tolerate, the schedule that exhausts us, the relationship that stifles us, the performance we know how to repeat, because the alternative feels too vague, too risky, too difficult to explain to others who are still caught in their own version of the trap. And so we wait, hoping something will shift externally to force the change we're too afraid to initiate internally, hoping for a sign, a breakdown, a miracle. Anything to give us permission to reclaim the time we've been giving away in perfectly acceptable, socially sanctioned ways. But the truth is, no one gives you that permission. You either take it or the theft continues. You either decide, without full clarity, without external approval, without a safety net, to disrupt the structure that's draining your time, or you remain inside it, functional and invisible, until your body begins to rebel, until your joy feels like a memory, until your reflection starts to feel like a stranger. And even then, the voice inside might still whisper, "You're fine," because fine is the perfect camouflage for a life that has been hollowed out by quiet compromises and subtle disconnection. And yet, you are not powerless. Because the moment you recognize the theft, the moment you feel the ache of absence and name it not as depression, not as failure, not as laziness, but as grief for the time you surrendered to other people's definitions of success, for the creativity you ignored to chase security, for the spontaneity you buried beneath planning, for the life you postponed while waiting for courage, that's the moment you begin to take your time back. Not in dramatic gestures, not by quitting everything, not by fleeing into fantasy, but by making one clear decision: to stop treating your aliveness as optional, to stop treating your time as something you owe to systems that do not see you, to stop saying later, when you know that what you want is possible now, not all of it, not perfectly, not without fear, but something, some small, meaningful act that disrupts the script and reminds your nervous system what it feels like to choose presence over autopilot. Because the antidote to time theft isn't productivity, it's participation. It's showing up to your own life not just as a manager, not just as a caretaker, not just as a responsible citizen of routines, but as someone who remembers that time is not just a resource. It is your most intimate terrain, your only real currency, and once you lose enough of it to things you don't love, don't believe in, or don't remember doing, the value of what remains becomes painfully clear. And so the question is not, how much time do you have left? The real question is, how much more of your life are you willing to spend on things you won't even remember living through? The nostalgia trap begins not with memory, but with longing, a quiet ache that pulls you backward, not toward a specific event, but toward a feeling you once had, or think you had, or maybe only wish you had, and it doesn't arrive loudly, it slips in during tired moments, in music that sounds like a decade you barely remember, in photos that capture a version of you who didn't yet know how things would unfold, in passing scents, fading songs. Or familiar places that feel like they're whispering something just out of reach, not facts, but fragments, emotional shadows of a past that seems softer, simpler, and somehow more real than the present that surrounds you now. That's the paradox. Nostalgia makes the past feel more beautiful than it was, not because it's lying to you, but because memory, by nature, is selective, biased toward what comforted you, what helped you survive, what gave you a sense of belonging, and so what you end up missing isn't the truth, but the filtered, softened echo of it. A version in which the pain is blurred and the joy is spotlighted, in which the struggles are romanticized or forgotten, and the result is a strange emotional trap. You begin to yearn for something that didn't really exist the way you remember it, but still hurts as if you've lost it. You find yourself missing high school not for the classes or the lockers or the cafeteria food, but for the way your laughter once felt unfiltered, or how friendship required no calendar, or how the smallest moments, a glance, a joke, a late-night message, felt like proof that you were real and connected and young enough not to be afraid of time. And even though you remember being anxious, confused, or lonely, those memories get dimmed beneath the weight of the longing. Replaced with a carefully edited montage that skips the awkward silences and freezes the warmth at its peak. And so you begin to wonder, was that the last time you were really alive? Was that version of you the truest one? Have you been declining ever since? These questions creep in when the present feels heavy, when the future feels uncertain, when your current life feels like maintenance instead of momentum, and nostalgia offers you an escape hatch, a portal back to a time when you didn't carry so much, when possibilities felt endless, when you believed that everything important was still ahead, and even if the details are fuzzy, the emotion is clear, you miss not just the time, but the version of yourself who belonged to that time. And that's where the trap tightens. Because nostalgia doesn't invite you to process or to understand, it invites you to escape, to emotionally relocate to a place you can no longer reach, and the more time you spend there in the imagined safety of the past, the more detached you become from what's real now, the more you compare your current self, your current relationships, your current environment to a gold-painted memory that no present moment can compete with, and the result is quiet but corrosive. A dissatisfaction with everything current, a subtle rejection of now, a suspicion that life's best moments are behind you, and what remains is merely a slower, dimmer, less magical version of what once was. You begin to chase those feelings again, not the moments, but the mood. You seek people who remind you of someone from before. You listen to playlists that belong to years you can't return to. You visit old places hoping to feel something stir. You open old messages, reread old journals, revisit old relationships, even broken ones, just to see if the thread is still there, and sometimes it is, but more often it's not, and the dissonance between memory and reality deepens the ache, because the present cannot give you the past again. And when it tries, it often fails you worse than if it had stayed silent. And yet you return. Because there's something addictive about the idea that who you were then was purer, freer, more alive, even if you know logically that you were also scared, unsure, overwhelmed. The nostalgia doesn't care about accuracy, it only cares about emotional resonance, and the more disconnected you feel from your present purpose, the more appealing that resonance becomes because it offers not just comfort but identity. It tells you who you used to be. And lets you borrow that sense of self when the current version of you feels fragmented or uncertain. But here is where nostalgia becomes most dangerous, not when it gives you warm feelings, but when it convinces you to stop growing, when it tells you that the peak has passed, that what once was cannot be matched, and so you begin to live smaller, less open to change, more cynical about possibility, more afraid of investing in new people, new experiences, new risks, because a part of you has already declared the story over, already decided that the best lines have been delivered. The most meaningful scenes already filmed, and now you're just W. Atching credits roll in slow motion, waiting for a feeling that will never return in the way you want it to. And yet, there is a difference between remembrance and entrapment. To remember is to reflect, to learn, to honor, but to be trapped is to idealize, to distort, to avoid. And in that distortion, you lose access to the truth not just of the past, but of the present, because the lens you're using to view now has been tinted by emotional longing. And everything that doesn't match the intensity of that longing feels flat, unworthy, or hollow, even if it's good, even if it's meaningful, even if it's exactly what your younger self dreamed of. So the work becomes not rejecting nostalgia, but recognizing its tricks, to learn how to remember without rewriting, to feel warmth without surrendering to illusion, to let the past inform but not imprison, because the reality is, the present moment has something the past never did: clarity, agency, the hard-won knowledge of who you are and what you've survived. And even if today doesn't feel as magical as you hoped, it is still the only time you can shape into something that someday you might miss for all the right reasons. Because the goal is not to stop longing, it's to make something now that's worth longing for later. And so the real question becomes, if the past feels sweeter than it was, what might the present feel like when you finally give it the chance to be remembered? You open up slowly, carefully, maybe even by accident. You say something true, not surface level, not polished, not funny, but raw, honest. Maybe it's about your past, maybe it's about your fear. Maybe it's about how tired you are of pretending that everything's okay. And for a second you feel lighter, more real, like you just gave someone a key to the inside. But then they hesitate, or change the subject, or flinch, or worse, they use it against you. And suddenly, the thing you thought would bring you closer becomes the thing that creates distance. That's the vulnerability punishment, the cruel paradox where the moments you show your truest self become the moments you get hurt the most. Not because vulnerability is wrong, but because it exposes something people don't always know how to hold. And instead of safety, you're met with withdrawal, discomfort, or manipulation. And the next time you feel like speaking, you don't, not because you're healed, because you remember what happened last time. It starts innocently. You're building a connection, maybe a friendship, maybe love, maybe even just trying to be understood. And the conversation gets deeper. You feel the energy shift. So you say something you usually keep hidden about how you grew up, or how lonely you sometimes feel even around people, or how afraid you are that nothing will ever change. And they look at you, and in that split second you know whether it landed or missed, whether they stayed present or retreated. Whether they're going to hold it or drop it. When they don't respond with care, the wound isn't just emotional, it's structural. Because vulnerability isn't just about what you said, it's about what it meant. It meant you trusted them. It meant you chose them. It meant you hoped they were someone safe. And when they look away or joke or ignore it, or even worse, twist it into something small, that trust collapses, not just in them, but in yourself too. Because now you question your own judgment. Why did I say that? Why did I think they'd understand? Why do I always go too deep too fast? You blame yourself. Not because it's your fault, but because it feels safer than admitting that maybe some people really just can't meet you where you are. That some people only want the version of you that's clean, charming, filtered, that they like you better when you're less real. And if the punishment is worse, if they mock it later or weaponize it in a fight or betray the secret, the damage runs deeper. It's not just shame, it's betrayal. It's a blueprint being rewritten in your brain that says, next time stay quiet. That says, this is why you keep things in. And you start to withdraw, you still talk, still laugh, still function, but the core of you stays sealed, because you've learned the cost of openness, and it's too high. And maybe the worst part is that you were taught to believe vulnerability is strength, that it's the key to connection, that it's the only way to be truly seen. But what no one tells you is that being seen is only healing if the person looking knows what they're seeing. Otherwise, you're just exposed. Otherwise, you're just raw in front of someone who doesn't know what to do with your truth or doesn't care. This is how people become guarded, not because they want to be cold, but because they've experienced the punishment of being warm, of being transparent, of showing up fully and being met with absence. So they adapt, they become selective. They hide behind humor, behind intellect, behind performance. They become likable, successful, admired, but not known, because knowing requires risk, and they've already paid the price. Sometimes the punishment is unintentional. The other person isn't cruel, just uncomfortable. They weren't expecting depth. They weren't ready. They don't know how to hold silence. Or they've never explored their own emotional landscape, so when you offer yours, they panic. They turn away not because they don't care, but because your honesty activates something in them they're not ready to feel. But the impact is the same. You still walk away feeling foolish, naked, ashamed. And that shame becomes a scar, invisible but sensitive. So the next time someone asks how you're doing, you say, fine, even when you're unraveling. You change the subject when things get too real. You smile on cue. You give people exactly what they're used to, which is everything except the truth. And no one notices, because you're good at it. You're good at seeming okay, at being the one who listens, who jokes, who gives. And deep down, a part of you starts to believe that maybe this is all you're allowed, that your feelings are too much, that your pain is too heavy, that your depth is an inconvenience. And then someone comes along who tries to reach you, who asks real questions, who notices when your voice drops or your eyes shift, and even though you want to open up, you don't, because you're waiting for the punishment. You're waiting for the moment when they'll prove that they're just like the others, and maybe they're not, but the fear keeps you silent, not because you don't trust them, but because you don't trust your ability to survive another rejection. This is how the cycle deepens. You crave intimacy, but you avoid it. You long to be understood, but you hide the parts that would make you knowable. You want someone to meet you fully, but you only offer them fragments. And when the relationship stays shallow, you blame them. But the truth is, you never really gave them a chance, so what's the way out? It's not about opening up to everyone. It's about learning to recognize who deserves your truth and who doesn't. It's about remembering that vulnerability is a gift, not a demand. That your story isn't a test for others to pass, it's a sacred thing you choose to share when the space is right. And sometimes that space is only found in yourself, in being the one who hears your own story first, who validates it, who doesn't flinch from the hard parts. Because when you become a safe place for yourself, the punishment from others doesn't hit as hard, it doesn't rewrite your worth, it doesn't close your heart. It just reminds you of what you already knew, that not everyone is meant to go where you're willing to go. And maybe that's okay, because the point of vulnerability isn't to be accepted by everyone, it's to find the few who can meet you there and stay. But until then, how many more times will you punish yourself for being open, just because someone else didn't know how to receive the truth?